Code Veronica is one of the most important stories in the entire Resident Evil series, and honestly, one of the most overlooked. Tonight, we're going through all of it. Claire, Steve, the Ashford twins, Rockfort Island, and the moment Wesker came back and reminded everyone exactly who he was. If you're enjoying the channel, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it's the best way to show your support. Part 1, 3 months. After Raccoon City. December of 1998 was a freezing countdown for Claire Redfield. She'd survived the nuclear destruction of Raccoon City, but her escape didn't bring her peace or safety. The United States government immediately took custody of 12-year-old Sherry Birkin to quarantine her blood because she carried rare antibodies from her G virus infection. Claire tried to stay with the child, but federal agents separated them by force, treating the orphan like government property. Before they dragged Sherry away, Claire held her close and made a solemn vow to find her again, promising that she'd never stop fighting until she exposed Umbrella and reunited their surrogate family. That promise changed everything for the former college student, making it impossible for her to return to her normal life. She couldn't go back to her classes or her friends after what she witnessed in the Midwestern disaster. Her brother Chris had vanished after the Arklay Mansion incident, and she was now completely alone, balanced between a corrupt company and a government that wanted her silent. The state handlers placed Sherry in a secure facility under strict observation, using her unique biology as a justification for indefinite detention. Claire watched the vehicle drive away, knowing that her civilian status gave her no legal leverage against the federal departments. She packed her bags, left her old apartment behind, and committed her life to a dangerous crusade that most people didn't even know existed. The memory of that separation stayed with her as the winter grew colder. She refused to let the state bury the truth of what happened to the Birkin family, or what the company did to the citizens of Raccoon City. Her moral compass didn't allow her to look away, even when her friends begged her to stay hidden. The government assumed a young woman would eventually break under the administrative pressure and accept their non-disclosure agreements. They didn't understand that the Redfield family shared a stubborn streak that institutional threats couldn't bend. Claire took her leather jacket, secured a fake identity card, and stepped out into the winter night to begin her real work. Imagine being the person who opened that file and saw what they were doing to a child. The transition from a normal student to a targeted fugitive happened overnight. She couldn't use her real bank accounts or contact her old acquaintances without triggering an alert on a federal mainframe. The state security departments wanted to keep a clean lid on the corporate conspiracy, and a witness like Claire was a loose thread they needed to clip. She spent her initial weeks on the run, learning how to slip past the stationary cameras and how to vanish into the crowds of transit hubs. Every bus ride was a calculated risk, and every rest stop was a potential trap set by her watchers. She didn't let the isolation break her resolve, drawing strength from the lingering scent of smoke that still stained her gear. Part 2. Still looking for Claire spent the next 2 months living as a monitored fugitive across Europe. She moved between cheap safe houses and relied on black market channels to stay ahead of the intelligence agencies that tracked her movements. Her main goal was tracing the digital footprint of her older brother, whose sudden radio silence after his investigation in the mountains left her deeply alarmed. Chris had told her he was going to Europe to look into Umbrella's primary headquarters, but he'd stopped answering his messages entirely. Claire knew he wouldn't leave her without a word unless he was trapped, captured, or running for his life from corporate assassins. Federal agencies monitored her communication logs and checked her transit registries at every border crossing. They wanted to intercept her before she could leak any classified documents to the international press. Claire used her analytical focus to spot their surveillance teams, changing her route at a moment's notice to slip through their perimeter. She didn't have a tactical squad or a federal badge, but she possessed an incredible survival instinct that she'd honed during the municipal slaughter. Her search led her through several hidden networks, matching rumors of anti-corporate resistance against the actual shipping manifests of the pharmaceutical giant. Her sibling intuition told her that Chris was still alive, but his trail was growing faint under the corporate security nets. Every phone call she made was a risk, and every automated telemachine she used left a trace for the handlers in Washington. She refused to slow down because she knew that stopping meant letting the company win. The world was trying to pretend that Raccoon City was a simple chemical accident, and she was one of the few witnesses who could prove otherwise. She followed an encrypted lead that pointed directly toward France, buying a ticket under a dead name and preparing to breach their most secure facility. The information she gathered in the underground channels wasn't reassuring. The black market was flooded with rumors of a tactical shift inside Umbrella, whispering that the old founders were losing their grip to younger, more aggressive executives. Chris had been poking into these specific fractures, trying to map the transport lines between the regional labs and the main offices. Claire realized her brother had underestimated how fast the company would protect its secrets. They weren't just hiring standard mercenaries anymore. They were deploying specialized security units designed to erase investigators without leaving a trace. Part 3. The Paris Umbrella Facility. In mid-December, Claire executed a high-risk infiltration into Umbrella's regional headquarters in Paris. The building was a pristine fortress of glass and steel, protected by automated security grids and visible laser traps that could detect a single fingerprint. She was searching for files that connected the French branch to the Arclay experiments, hoping to find her brother's last known location. Instead, her intrusion triggered a silent alarm that brought the elite security units down the corridor. The tactical forces pinned her down inside a laboratory wing, their automatic weapons cutting off her escape routes. Claire used her quick reflexes to sprint through a hail of gunfire, diving through a plate glass window to evade their capture teams. She managed to take out several guards with a scavenged handgun, but a corporate helicopter cornered her on the roof of the installation. Outnumbered and facing an entire squad of trained mercenaries, she dropped her weapon and raised her hands. The company didn't execute her on the spot, realizing that the sister of Chris Redfield was a valuable asset for their intelligence division. Following her high-profile arrest, she spent 10 grueling days inside an underground cell beneath the city. Corporate interrogators questioned her around the clock, trying to break her spirit and discover who was funding her European transit. Claire stayed silent, refusing to give them a single name or confirm how much she knew about their viral research. The damp cell smelled of copper and wet stone, a familiar reminder of the laboratories she'd escaped 2 months earlier. Once they realized she wouldn't talk, the handlers bound her wrists, put a hood over her head, and loaded her onto a military transport flight destined for a remote corporate prison camp. The facility's interior was a testament to corporate excess, where advanced medical gear sat adjacent to security bulkheads. During her brief run through the halls, Claire noticed shipping cases marked with liquid nitrogen indicators, meaning they were actively moving live biological assets through the civilian sectors of the city. The researchers she passed didn't look like scientists. They looked like bureaucrats who handled lethal pathogens with the same indifference they'd show to factory inventory. It was the same corporate mindset that burned her hometown, completely unbothered by the human cost of their patents. Part 4. Who Rodrigo Raval was Rodrigo Juan. Raval was a veteran security officer assigned to command the prison sector on Rockfort Island. Born into a strict military lineage, he handled his administrative duties with a cold precision that earned him the respect of the corporate board. He wasn't a psychotic scientist or a corrupt executive. He was a disciplined soldier who believed he was protecting corporate assets from international terrorists. His perspective changed when he was tasked with managing the transport and detention of Claire Redfield, whose civilian background didn't match the descriptions of the radical saboteurs he'd been warned about by his superiors. Rodrigo possessed a deeply buried moral conscience that clashed with the company's brutal policies. He watched Claire in her cell, noting that her eyes lacked the manic aggression of a spy, showing only the quiet determination of a sister looking for her family. Long before the island came under attack, the commander found himself deeply reconsidering his loyalty to the pharmaceutical empire. He'd seen how the company treated its workers, disposing of failed researchers like simple industrial waste, and he recognized that he was just another gear in a machine that didn't value human life. His injuries from an old deployment were flaring up, a constant reminder of the cost of his service. The officer spent his late shifts reading Claire's file, realizing that the official reports about the Raccoon City outbreak were completely fabricated. He knew that his employers had released a biological weapon on a civilian population, and his role as a prison guard made him an accessory to the cover-up. Rodrigo felt a growing shame as he walked the iron catwalks of the jail, listening to the ocean waves crash against the rocky cliffs below. He didn't say a word to his captive, but his stance softened whenever he brought her rations. He was a proud man, trapped in a bad contract, waiting for a moment of clarity that would force him to choose between his orders and his humanity. His family history was tied to old military campaigns, giving him a rigid definition of honor that the company's lawyers couldn't understand. They expected him to handle human cargo like simple numbers on a ledger, ignoring the basic rights of the inmates under his watch. Rodrigo watched the younger guards grow increasingly sadistic under Alfred's erratic command, their behavior reflecting the rot at the top of the family tree. He kept his own unit disciplined, but he could feel his control slipping as the island's isolation deepened. The corporate memos arriving from Europe grew colder, demanding higher efficiency metrics from the processing plants. Part 5. The Ashford Family History. The Ashfords were one of the true patrician founding lineages of Umbrella Pharmaceuticals. Co-founder Edward Ashford discovered the progenitor virus alongside Spencer in 1966, utilizing his massive wealth to build the first research laboratories. Edward believed that the virus could be used to unlock human evolution, but his sudden death in 1968 allowed Spencer to seize total control of the company's assets. Edward's son, Alexander, took over the family estate, but he was a scientifically mediocre man who couldn't match his father's brilliant legacy. His insecurity caused a massive decline in the family's prestige inside the corporate hierarchy. Spencer systematically sidelined Alexander, moving his research funding to rival laboratories and treating the Ashford name like a historical relic. Desperate to restore his standing and prove his worth to the board, Alexander launched a highly classified eugenics project in a secret Antarctic facility. He believed that the only way to save his family was to create a genetically perfect intellectual heir who could outsmart Spencer. He traveled to the family's ancestral vaults, extracting genetic material from the mummified remains of their brilliant 11th century matriarch, Veronica Ashford. whose legendary beauty and intelligence had defined their lineage for generations. This hidden experiment was his final gamble against the shifting politics of the board. Alexander spent his fortune building the sub-zero clean rooms beneath the shelf ice, completely cut off from the main corporate directory. He viewed his own bloodline as a puzzle to be solved, completely ignoring the ethical warnings of his remaining assistants. He wanted a child who could handle the company's future, a savior born from the ancient code of their dead ancestors. He didn't realize that his frantic engineering would produce an intellectual apex predator that he couldn't control, setting off a chain of events that would eventually destroy his family entirely. The family's decline was visible in the architecture of their grand estates, where medieval stone met modern reinforcement. Alexander tried to maintain the appearance of royal power, but his corporate peers knew his laboratories were producing nothing but expensive failures. He grew increasingly isolated, his letters to Spencer remaining unanswered while his debts mounted in the Swiss banks. The eugenics project wasn't just a scientific goal. It was a desperate bid for survival in a company that devoured weak executives. He spent hours talking to the portrait of Veronica, begging the dead queen for a shred of her legendary insight. Part 6. Project Code. Veronica executed in a secret Antarctic facility in 1971. Project Code. Veronica sought to artificially clone the mummified matriarch's legendary traits. Alexander utilized a surrogate mother matrix to incubate the genetically engineered embryos, monitoring their cellular development from his console array. The twin birth yielded a highly uneven biological result that terrified the research staff. Alfred Ashford possessed an average intelligence and an unstable emotional baseline that made him useless for advanced research. His twin sister, Alexia Ashford, manifested as a hyper-advanced child prodigy who could solve complex equations before she could walk, showing an intellectual capacity that surpassed her grandfather's legendary mind. Alexia became the center of Alexander's world, while Alfred was pushed into the background as an administrative afterthought. The young girl viewed her father with a cold detachment, recognizing his scientific mediocrity before she even reached her teenage years. She spent her days inside the clean rooms, analyzing her own genetic code and realizing she was fundamentally different from the humans around her. Alexander watched her progress with a mixture of immense pride and growing terror, realizing he'd created a creature that lacked a shred of human empathy. He hid the project's data sheets in a secure vault, desperate to keep Spencer from discovering what he'd built. His precautions came too late to save him from his own creations. The twins grew up in total isolation, developing a private language and a mutual contempt for the father who had manufactured them in a laboratory. They looked at the family portraits in the grand hall, believing they were destined to rule the planet as biological gods. Alexander's secret project had succeeded too well, producing a child who looked at human beings like simple raw material for her upcoming viral experiments. The surrogate matrix used in the experiment left no maternal records in the company's central files. Alexander had wiped the names of the donors to ensure that no external line could claim a share of the genetic results. The twins were raised by automated systems and low-level tutors who were forbidden from speaking to them without written authorization from the director. This sterile environment shaped their psychological layout, turning their shared blood into an absolute fortress against the rest of the world. They didn't have a childhood. They had a continuous observation log that updated every hour. Part 7. Alfred Ashford. Alfred grew up completely overshadowed by his sister's legendary genius, which fostered a deep-seated emotional dependence on her approval. He developed an intense psychological resentment toward his father, who treated him like a failed experiment because he didn't possess Alexia's advanced intellect. In 1983, the twins discovered Alexander's hidden journals, detailing their artificial surrogate origins. Enraged by the betrayal of their noble blood, Alfred assisted his sister in binding their father to an operating table, turning the mediocre scientist into a live test subject for their newest viral strain. Following Alexia's subsequent disappearance into her cryogenic stasis pod, Alfred spent 15 isolated years running the Rockfort Island prison base alone. He was completely unable to handle the psychological reality of her absence, and his mind slowly collapsed into a severe form of paranoia. He maintained the Grand Palace on the cliffs, dressing in his old military uniform and holding imaginary conversations with his sister to keep the illusion of family prestige alive. The corporate executives in Europe tolerated his erratic behavior because the prison remained secure, completely unaware that the local commander was losing his grip on reality. He ruled the island with a theatrical cruelty that terrified the guards and the inmates alike. He viewed the prisoners as dirty peasants who existed only to serve the Ashford lineage, punishing the slightest infraction with hard labor or public execution. His hidden playroom inside the mansion was filled with his sister's old dolls and dresses, a private sanctuary where he could escape the administrative pressure of his corporate contract. He lived in a perpetual loop of grief and resentment, waiting for the day his brilliant twin would awaken and restore their family to its rightful place at the top of the corporate world. His military uniform was a customized design that didn't match any official branch of the world's armies, a fabric construction that existed only to feed his personal grandiosity. He spent hours drilling the island's garrison in the burning sun, demanding absolute perfection from soldiers who were regular corporate contractors. The men learned to fear his sudden shifts in mood, knowing that a misplaced salute could result in a transfer to the lower disposal pits. Alfred didn't care about their logistics or their comfort. He looked at the base as a private stage for his family's historical theatre. Part 8. Alexia Ashford. Alexia was appointed chief researcher of Umbrella's Antarctic facility at just 10 years old, a career achievement that shocked the entire scientific establishment. By 1983, the 12-year-old prodigy successfully engineered the T. Veronica virus by splicing progenitor code with the prehistoric genetic material of queen ants and ancient plant cells. Recognizing that high doses caused immediate mental dissolution, she made the calculating, cold decision to self-administer the untested pathogen to see how it integrated with human tissue. She didn't want to become a mindless ghoul like the subjects in her father's laboratories. Her research confirmed that the human body needed to absorb the viral strands at a sub-zero metabolic rate to prevent cellular destruction, a process that required a massive investment of time. She entered a voluntary 15-year cryogenic stasis pod, setting the automated systems to monitor her vital signs while she slept beneath the ice. She went under, fully believing she'd awaken as an immortal biological goddess, ready to reshape the planet's ecosystem according to her own design. Her departure left the family's legacy in the hands of her unstable brother, who treated her pod like a holy shrine. Alexia's mind remained active inside the cryogenic fog, dreaming of a coordinated network where every living creature answered to her telepathic commands. She didn't feel a shard of fear or regret when the needles entered her veins. She looked at the virus as her true mother, a catalyst that would elevate her bloodline above the limitations of natural selection. The entire Antarctic base became a silent monument to her vanity, waiting for the countdown timer to reach 0. The young researcher had spent months observing the social hierarchy of the ant colonies she kept in her private laboratory quarters. She was fascinated by how the Queen could direct thousands of individual workers without a single error in coordination, their identities completely absorbed into the survival of the nest. She viewed human society as a messy, inefficient layout that could be improved by a similar biological structure. Her father's constant bumbling and his pathetic pleas for her affection only confirmed her belief that normal humans were an obsolete branch of evolution. Part 9. T. Veronica Biology. The T. Veronica strain differed violently from standard variants in Umbrella's portfolio. While old pathogens mutated hosts into mindless, decaying corpses that hunted by simple instinct, T. Veronica was designed to build a hyper-coordinated organic hive mind. It established an advanced fire pheromone system within the host's vascular channels, giving them telepathic command over specialized biological networks. The host's blood underwent a radical chemical change, gaining the ability to violently ignite into open flames upon contact with oxygen, turning their fluid into a tactical weapon during close-quarters combat. However, this evolutionary leap required a completely willing, highly informed host whose central nervous system could slowly internalize the viral strands over 15 continuous years. Any forced injection or accelerated dosing resulted in an immediate genetic rejection that tore the muscle layers apart, destroying the subject's higher brain functions within minutes. The pathogen required a calm cortex to direct its mutation tracks, which made it useless for standard battlefield deployment, where soldiers experienced extreme adrenaline spikes. It was a royal virus built for aristocrats who could afford to wait more than a decade for their augmentation to complete. Alexander's failure to stabilize the virus in his own body provided the data Alexia needed to perfect the stasis process. The plant cells inside the pathogen created a durable cell wall that preserved the host's physical youth, while their tissue integrated with the insect DNA. The resulting symbiosis allowed the user to generate independent appendages without losing their human appearance or their cognitive abilities. It was the most elegant and hazardous project the company had ever funded. A biological engine that treated the human body like a canvas for a new species. Picture what that does to an organic network when the leader can direct every single mutation track through a simple chemical shift. The virus didn't rely on random cell damage to force adjustments. It followed a blueprinted plan that integrated with the host's consciousness. This made the T. Veronica strain fundamentally different from the chaotic mutations produced by Birkin's work in the Raccoon City labs. It wasn't looking to create a bigger monster. It wanted to establish a clean hierarchy where the Queen sat at the center of a living world. Part 10. Steve Burnside. Steve Burnside was a brash, intensely defensive 17-year-old inmate trapped on Rockfort Island. His life before the prison was defined by his father's employment as a low-level clerk in Umbrella's logistics division. His father grew greedy, trying to auction corporate chemical files to a rival syndicate on the global black market to clear his mounting debts. The company's security forces intercepted the transmission, systematically executed Steve's mother in her home, and dragged both father and son to the island to face a lifetime of hard labor in the processing plants. This sudden betrayal left Steve with immense psychological scars that altered his defensive character. He'd watched his family line get erased in a single afternoon because his father trusted the wrong handlers, leaving him with a deep hatred for authority figures and corporate systems. He refused to cooperate with the other inmates, relying entirely on his own agility to survive the daily sweeps. He wore a heavy leather vest and carried himself with a hostile exterior, masking an internal anxiety that he couldn't share with anyone on the base. He looked at his father across the prison yard with a quiet, burning resentment. blaming him for the slaughter of his mother and the loss of their freedom. Steve didn't believe in rescue or justice. He knew that the company's machine would eventually process them into corpses once their labor metrics dropped. His loneliness turned into a volatile temper that made him dangerous in tight spaces, his fingers twitching whenever he neared a guard's holster. He was a teenager who had been hollowed out by corporate malice, waiting for a chance to break the bars of his cage. His daily routine on the island was an exercise in pure hostility, his interactions with the prison guards always ending in shouting matches or physical altercations. He refused to sign the work logs or accept the basic rations without a fight, forcing Rodrigo's men to use restraints to keep him in line. The other prisoners avoided him, recognizing that his unstable temper made him an easy target for Alfred's public punishments. Steve didn't care about their community, choosing to spend his free time staring at the security fences and looking for an opening. Part 11. Wesker after the mansion. Albert Wesker miraculously survived his execution by the Arklay tyrant in July of 1998. Before he allowed the monster to impale him, he injected himself with an experimental prototype virus given to him by his old colleague, William Birkin. The pathogen brought him back from clinical death, rewriting his cellular structure to grant him superhuman speed, unnatural kinetic strength, and glowing red irises that he hid behind dark sunglasses. Now operating on behalf of a shadowy rival syndicate, he commanded an elite paramilitary wing known as the Host Capture Force. Wesker was still learning to calibrate his new abilities, his body moving with an accelerated velocity that defied natural human biology. He could dodge close-range bullets and split stone columns with his bare hands, but the strain required a constant supply of specialized serum to keep his system from rejecting the viral strands. His primary objective was to infiltrate Rockfort Island and secure a pristine sample of the T. Veronica virus, which he recognized as the missing link needed to build a bioweapons division for his new employers. He felt a deep contempt for Spencer's old methods, viewing the standard zombies as clumsy toys compared to the coordinated hive mind Alexia had engineered. The T. Veronica virus was the ultimate asset for his new syndicate because it allowed a single leader to control an entire army through pheromone links. Wesker didn't care about the Ashford family's noble blood or their historical prestige. He looked at Rockfort Island as a simple supply vault that he intended to clear before the rest of the world noticed his return. His survival remained a secret to his old teammates in Stars, who believed his body had burned along with the rest of the laboratory in the mountains. He used this official oblivion to build his new network, recruiting experienced operators from the global espionage market who didn't ask questions about his glowing eyes. He spent months inside hidden facilities, testing his physical limits against automated targets and adjusting the chemical balance of his blood. The prototype virus had changed his definition of human potential, making him look at his former peers like simple historical curiosities. Part 12. Host Capture Force Operations. The Host Capture Force functioned as a highly funded, state-of-the-art corporate espionage army. Wesker's hidden corporate employers cared absolutely nothing for international treaties or sovereign borders, operating in the lawless space between corporate empires. They wanted the T. Veronica pathogen specifically to counter Umbrella's global market monopoly, breaking Spencer's control over the biological weapons trade. They provided Wesker with a massive arsenal, including stealth bomber aircraft, specialized tactical gear, and advanced combat drones called Seekers. These electronic drones were deployed weeks before the raid, mapping out the island's defense networks and tracking the local guard rotations from high altitudes. The syndicate's analysts isolated the weak spots in Alfred's infrastructure, confirming that the commander's psychological deterioration had left the communications array vulnerable to internal sabotage. Wesker managed the operation from a stealth submarine parked off the coast, waiting for the winter storms to block the local radar dishes. The mercenaries, under his command, were highly trained operators who wore advanced armor and handled customized submachine guns with clinical efficiency. They weren't fighting for a political ideology or a national flag. They were processing a corporate target for a high-paying buyer. The deployment plan was calculated to minimize public exposure while maximizing the structural damage to the facility. Wesker stood near the hatch, his red eyes reflecting the green light of the console as the strike teams moved into their drop zones under the cover of the night rain. The tactical units used silent parachutes to breach the upper ridges of the island, bypassing the stationary radar lines with specialized carbon fiber gear. They didn't drop a single flare or use open radio channels, their movements coordinated through an advanced laser grid that updated their positions every second. Each operator carried a data collection unit that could download archive files from the local terminals within minutes of contact. They treated the entire base like an automated warehouse, moving through the barracks with a quiet efficiency that left no room for defensive countermeasures. Part 13, Christmas Eve. On December 17th, 1998, Wesker's forces launched a devastating surprise air raid and internal sabotage operation across Rockfort Island. The stealth bombers roared through the dark sky, dropping heavy payloads that obliterated the base's automated turret lines and crushed the primary communications infrastructure within the first seconds of the assault. Internal sabotage teams cut the main power cables, plunging the research sector into pitch darkness as emergency sirens began to wail across the barracks. Umbrella's local security forces took massive casualties, their defensive formations shattered by the precision of the operators. In the absolute operational chaos, a highly unstable containment tank ruptured inside the base's lowest research wing. The breach released a concentrated wave of the T-virus through the ventilation shafts, rapidly sweeping through the military facility and infecting the wounded staff before they could reach their biohazard suits. The pathogen moved with an exponential velocity through the complex, converting dead guards into reanimated corpses that tore through their own medical bays. The island's defense structures collapsed completely, transforming a disciplined prison colony into a hazardous arena of smoke and fire. Alfred Ashford watched his monitors fail from his high command suite, his manic laughter turning into a scream of rage as his palace shook from the concussive blasts. He tried to coordinate a counterattack, but his radio links were completely dead, leaving him isolated with his delusions. The infected guard dogs broke out of their pens, tracking the scent of fresh blood down the mud paths of the installation. The entire base was burning, its foundations buckling under the intensity of the fires, as the virus claimed the remaining survivors of the garrison. Imagine being the person who had to navigate those corridors in the dark, while the walls were physically melting around you. The virus didn't need weeks to degrade the unit cohesion. It turned friends into predators in the smoky lanes, before the first aid teams could find their medical crates. The lack of emergency lighting increased the panic, causing the uninfected guards to fire blindly down the stairs at anything that moved. The containment protocols were completely useless, because the physical structures holding the test subjects had been shattered by the initial bombing runs. Part 14, Rodrigo's Decision. As the virus swept through the installation, a heavily bleeding Rodrigo Raval sat trapped inside the underground prison block. He'd suffered severe shrapnel wounds from the initial bomb blast, and his uniform was soaked in dark blood from his torn shoulder. He listened to the wet footsteps and the guttural groans echoing from the corridor outside, realizing that the defense structures had completely failed and that his own death was an absolute certainty. He looked across the iron bars at his high-profile captive, Claire Redfield, who remained calm despite the shaking ceiling. Rodrigo dragged his body toward her console, his hand steady as he turned the manual safety key and threw open her electronic cell door. He didn't release her out of a sudden belief that she'd escape the burning island, but out of a final moral choice to let her die, fighting in the open air rather than suffocating in a corporate cage. He handed her a simple combat knife and his personal lighter, his voice a gravelly whisper as he told her to run before the ghouls reached the block. Claire looked at her captor, recognizing the exhaustion in his face and the genuine sincerity of his action. She offered to help him leave the cell, but Rodrigo refused to move, telling her that his contract was finished and his wounds would only slow her down. He leaned against the stone wall, his sidearm resting on his knee, as the door hissed shut behind her. The veteran officer had finally broken his loyalty to the company, choosing a quiet act of mercy as his final performance on the island, completely indifferent to what his employers would say about his treason. The white fog from the broken pipes reduced the visibility to a few feet as Claire backed away. Imagine opening that cell door and realizing your final act as a soldier was an act of deliberate sabotage against the company that paid your pension. Rodrigo didn't expect Claire to survive the cemetery paths, but he wanted her to have a choice that his managers had denied to every other test subject on the base. He took a slow breath, his hand steady on the grip of his handgun, as the first shadow broke through the steam cloud at the end of the hall. He'd spent his entire life following scripts, but in the dark, he found his own path. Part 15. The Prison's Cemetery. Claire stepped outside into a freezing, torrential rainstorm, her boots sinking into the thick mud of the prison cemetery. The air carried the sharp scent of ozone and burning fuel, mixed with the damp rot of the rain-softened soil that lined the graves. Lacking any firearms or protective gear in the dark, her reflexes kept her alert as the virus caused zombified inmates to violently claw their way out of the ground. The pale eyes of the undead tracked her silhouette through the heavy downpour, their fingers reaching for her throat as she executed rapid evasion maneuvers between the stone markers. She scrambled up a slick dirt ridge, her fingers raw from the gravel, as she tried to orient herself in the blinding storm. A sudden, wild barrage from a heavy-mounted machine gun erupted from a nearby guard tower, the high-caliber bullets tearing up the concrete right in front of her feet. The tracer rounds illuminated the rain in brief flashes, nearly ending her night before she could even find a proper weapon or orient herself in the dark. Claire dove behind a metal shipping crate, her heart rate spiking as the concussive blasts shook the iron plating against her back. The shooter in the tower was firing blindly into the dark, his muzzle flash cutting through the black smoke that hung over the yard. Claire pressed her body against the wet mud, knowing that a single hit from those rounds would tear her vascular channels apart instantly. She monitored her surroundings, looking for an opening in his line of fire, while the zombies closed in on her position from the lower paths. The cemetery had become a hazardous bottleneck, where her civilian clothing offered no protection against the tactical assets of the base. The mud was a major obstacle, its thick consistency trapping her ankles whenever she tried to build up speed for a sprint. The undead were relentless, their broken limbs moving with an unnatural momentum that ignored the mechanical constraints of their rotting joints. Claire used her combat knife to deflect a lunging guard, the cold steel cutting through his uniform fabric. before she pushed his body down into the open ditch. She could hear the distinct sound of more coffins breaking beneath the surface, the rain liquefying the upper topsoil layers. Part 16. Steve Burnside's entrance. The shooter in the tower was Steve Burnside, who immediately released the heavy trigger upon realizing he'd targeted a living civilian girl rather than a zombified guard. Steve leapt down from the iron platform with reckless agility, his dual submachine guns resting casually against his leather vest as he evaluated her stance. He introduced himself with a brash grin, his tone carrying a defensive dismissal, as he told Claire that a civilian girl would only jam up his progress and slow him down during the breakout. This hostile encounter initiated one of the most complicated, high-stress survival partnerships in the entire history of the company's hot zones. Claire didn't let his arrogance break her focus, noting his twitchy fingers and his young age. Steve checked his ammunition clips, his paranoid eyes scanning the brush for any movement from the infected guard dogs. He refused to hold her hand or share his guns, turning his back to march toward the main gates alone. Claire followed him through the smoking rubble, her independent character allowing her to handle his defensive insults without losing her own temper. They were two different worlds trapped in the same tactical disaster, their mutual trust non-existent as they breached the outer fence. Steve's movements were fast but undisciplined, his survival based more on raw athleticism than actual military training. He fired short bursts into the darkness whenever a shadow crossed the gravel path, wasting his rounds on targets that Claire could have easily bypassed with simple stealth. He didn't want to hear her advice about ammunition conservation, his defensive shell blocking her attempts to establish a clean communication line. He kept moving toward the airport sector, convinced that he could find an operational aircraft to leave the island before the main facility burned to the ground. The teenager's isolation had turned his grief into a sharp edge that he used to keep everyone at a distance. He didn't view Claire as a comrade. He saw her as an unnecessary risk that increased the odds of his own recapture. His conversation was a series of sharp deflections, masking the terror of a child who had seen his family line disassembled by corporate security squads. He handled his weapons with a practiced ease, but his eyes constantly flicked toward the shadows, expecting the company's executioners to step out from behind every burning truck. Claire stayed behind him, her boots maintaining a steady rhythm on the wet asphalt as she checked their rear layout. She recognized the defensive patterns in his behavior, having seen similar trauma in the survivors she'd pulled from the Midwestern disaster. She didn't press him for information, letting his anger burn itself out against the reality of the infected environment. They crossed the outer checkpoint, the iron gates twisted by previous mortar rounds, and stepped into the main logistics yard where the real architecture of the base became visible. The fire from the main reactor wing was casting long, distorted shadows across the shipping crates, turning the complex into a maze of orange light and deep blackness. Steve stopped near a fuel tanker, his hands signaling for silence as a pack of modified hounds moved through the narrow alley ahead. Claire raised her weapon, her sight capturing the lead animal as its claws clicked against the gravel surface. They had no margin for error, their individual goals entirely secondary to the immediate mechanics of remaining vertical in a facility that was actively coming apart. Part 17. The Prison Complex. Armed with only a combat knife and a basic handgun, scavenged from a dead guard, Claire methodically navigated the burning prison blocks. The virus outbreak was spreading at an exponential rate through the barracks, converting thousands of military personnel into aggressive predators within a few hours. Claire was forced to ration her ammunition meticulously, tracking her targets through her handgun sights and firing only when they crossed her defensive spacing line. She searched the administrative offices for security keys and structural blueprints, desperately trying to locate an alternate extraction route before the island's commander could log her coordinates on his terminal. The narrow corridors were filled with the debris of the air raid, the walls scorched by electrical fires that leaked toxic vapor from the broken transformers. She found several corporate memos detailing the transport of specialized test subjects, confirming that the entire installation functioned as a live field for testing tactical assets. The standard zombies were the most visible result of the breach, but her progress was slowed by the presence of mutated security hounds that tracked her through the smoke lanes. She kept her back to the concrete walls, her spatial focus allowing her to map the intersecting halls without getting cornered by the closing pack. The administrative center was a wreck of scattered paperwork and broken monitors, the files confirming that Alfred had been ignoring the biohazard warnings from his senior medical staff for days. Claire managed to secure a security card from a dead administrator, her fingers cold as she slid the plastic through the electronic interface to open the lower warehouse locks. She could hear the distinct sound of heavy footsteps echoing from the floor above, meaning the infection had reached the upper executive offices. She moved through the storage bays, collecting green herbs to dress her minor cuts before the damp air could compromise her stamina. The layout of the facility was designed to maximize internal control, with every sector separated by heavy pressure doors that required specific administrative clearances. Claire noticed that the shipping manifests listed several shipments destined for Antarctica, confirming that the island worked in tandem with their southern operation. The corporate paperwork described human test material with the same terminology used for industrial machinery, a chilling reminder of the cold reality behind the company's pristine public face. She stuffed the relevant maps into her vest, her focus locked on finding the primary airfield before the entire ridge was consumed by the expanding fires. The storage units were filled with specialized equipment, including anti-biohazard suits and chemical containers that had been left behind during the frantic evacuation. Claire bypassed the heavier gear, knowing that excess weight would only degrade her agility in the narrow maintenance shafts. She spotted a secondary terminal that was still operational, its screen flashing with red evacuation alerts that indicated a total system failure across the island. The countdown was visible on every panel, a digital warning that her window for a clean exit was closing with every tick of the mainframe clock. She emerged from the lower levels into a loading dock, the cool rain providing a brief relief from the intense heat of the server rooms. The yard was littered with abandoned transport trucks, their engines idling as the remaining drivers were converted into mindless predators by the ambient viral lines. Claire checked her weapons magazine, confirming she had only 7 rounds remaining before she'd be forced to rely entirely on her blade. She stepped into the darkness of the paths, her senses alert for any sound that didn't match the natural rhythm of the storm. Part 18. Alfred's Introduction. Claire suffered a direct, theatrical ambush from Alfred Ashford, who pinned her down on a raised palace bridge using a high-powered bolt-action sniper rifle. Alfred delivered a manic monologue over the base intercoms, displaying an extreme aristocratic contempt and baselessly blaming Claire for coordinating the host capture force air raid. His erratic shooting patterns tore up the ornate stone railings around her, his delusional historical references confirming that his mind had completely collapsed into paranoia. Claire pressed her body against the marble tiles, her spatial awareness allowing her to calculate his reload cycle between the concussive shots. The commander viewed her survival as a personal insult to his family's prestige, his laughter echoing through the speakers like a broken record. He refused to look at the actual fires consuming his base, choosing to chase a single civilian girl across his bridges to satisfy his own fragile vanity. Claire used the smoke from a nearby explosion to break his line of sight, scrambling toward the grand entrance of the main residence while his bullets chipped the plaster near her hood. He was a dangerous director who handled his military assets like a child playing with tin soldiers, his voice cracking whenever his targets slipped through his crosshairs. Imagine being the person who had to listen to that manic voice over the loudspeakers while navigating a narrow bridge over a 100-foot drop. Alfred didn't care about tactical efficiency. He wanted a dramatic execution that would prove his superiority to the hidden watchers in Europe. He fired his vintage weapon with a frantic pace, his hands shaking from adrenaline as his aristocratic fantasies collided with Claire's practical survival skills. She reached the heavy oak doors of the manor, her breath coming in short gasps as the lock mechanism clicked into place, cutting off his immediate pursuit. The interior of the palace was a bizarre monument to his family's dead history, with suits of medieval armor standing adjacent to automated security panels. Alfred's voice continued to filter through the internal intercoms, his narrative growing increasingly detached from the reality of the burning barracks outside. He spoke of his sister in the present tense, promising her that the American spy would be processed before the morning inspection. Claire moved through the grand foyer, her handgun raised as she evaluated the multiple gallery doors that lined the upper balcony. The architecture was a physical trap designed to funnel intruders into open kill zones, where the director could monitor them from his observation booths. Every painting on the wall seemed to hold a hidden lens, tracking her movement through the long galleries with a quiet, mechanical precision. Claire didn't let the surveillance break her composure. Her eyes focused on finding a manual override that would disable the estate's main locking system. She could hear the distinct sound of mechanisms turning behind the woodwork, indicating that Alfred was actively altering the layout from his central console. She found a secondary staircase that led down into the private servants' quarters. The narrow stone steps, a welcome contrast to the wide, vulnerable spaces of the main hall. The lower levels were quiet, the air thick with the scent of old wood and lavender water that didn't match the industrial rot of the laboratories below. Claire moved through the dark pantry, her fingers tracing the edge of her knife as she prepared for his next theatrical move, knowing that a man with a broken identity was more unpredictable than any automated security system. Part 19. Alfred's dissociative identity. Living in complete isolation, with the memory of his missing twin sister for 15 years, had shattered Alfred's mind, causing him to develop severe dissociative identity disorder. To cope with his extreme grief, he constructed a vivid female persona, frequently cross-dressing in Alexia's old aristocratic gowns, and holding full, verbal arguments with himself in her voice inside a private, hidden playroom. He was entirely unable to process reality, genuinely believing his sister was actively speaking to him from behind the curtains of the estate. Claire discovered his secret sanctuary after clearing the upper residence blocks, finding the makeup tables and the encrypted diaries that documented his mental decline. The proud commander had turned his entire life into a theatrical illusion, his identity split between a ruthless military director and a delicate noble queen who managed the family's ancient legacy from the dark. The playroom was decorated with expensive historical antiques that matched the layout of their old European estates, a sterile stage where he could escape the administrative failure of his current corporate assignment. He'd stand in front of the full-length mirrors, his voice shifting to a soft soprano as he adjusted the lace collar of his dress, completely detached from the smoking ruins of his base outside. Claire watched from the shadow of the doorway as he argued with his own reflection, his face twisting with a deep psychological pain that no viral pathogen could duplicate. He was a victim of his family's eugenics program, long before he became an executive for the pharmaceutical giant, his mind warped by the cold expectations of his dead father. When he noticed her intrusion, his expression shifted from aristocratic vanity to a wild, murderous rage. He grabbed his rifle from the velvet couch, his voice a chaotic mixture of both personas, as he ordered his remaining security assets to clear the room of the civilian spy. The transition between his two mental states was marked by a sharp shift in his posture, his military discipline completely dissolving into the dramatic gestures of an opera singer. He handled the dress fabric with a frantic reverence, terrified that a single drop of oil or sweat would compromise the clean lines of his sister's wardrobe. The diaries on his desk revealed the full timeline of his decline, showing how his daily letters to the European board had grown increasingly incoherent as the years passed. He was an executive who had been left behind by his employers, a useful tool whose madness kept the black site secure. Imagine opening a private locker and finding the complete records of a family that had systematically erased its own humanity to satisfy an ancient lineage requirement. Alfred didn't look at himself as a sick man. He believed he was the sole defender of a holy bloodline that was destined to inherit the planet's resources. His guards didn't answer his frantic calls over the radio, their reanimated corpses already wandering through the lower gardens below his balcony. He stood alone in his sanctuary, his rifle shaking against his shoulder as Claire stepped back into the corridor to avoid his chaotic line of fire. The room was filled with the heavy scent of vintage perfume and gun oil, a suffocating mixture that reflected the internal state of his fractured intellect. Claire closed the heavy wooden door, the lock clicking into place as his initial rounds punched through the panels from the inside. She knew his tactical perspective was completely broken, his movements dictated by an internal script that had nothing to do with the actual security of the island. She turned toward the upper gallery, her focus locked on finding the mechanical keys that would open the outer perimeter gates before his madness could trap them both. Part 20. The Gold Lugers. Claire tracked Steve to an ornate study where he had locked himself in after uncovering a pair of decorative gold Luger pistols. The antique firearms functioned as the physical keys required to unlock the main Ashford private manor on the ridge. When Steve's reckless removal of the guns from their display rack triggered an automated, crushing wall trap, the iron ceilings began to descend to crush him. Claire used her quick reflexes and spatial awareness to bypass the locking mechanisms from the outside terminal, executing a split-second rescue that marked the first real bond of trust between the two teenagers. Steve emerged from the room with a pale face, his defensive exterior completely vanishing as he thanked her for saving his life. He handed over the antique weapons, realizing that his self-reliance wasn't enough to survive the traps Alfred had built into the floors of his house. They stood inside the smoking study, the hum of the deactivated trap, a quiet reminder that they needed to combine their skills if they wanted to reach the airstrip alive. Steve adjusted his vest, his paranoid eyes dropping to the floor as he admitted that his brash attitude had nearly turned him into a permanent resident of the graveyard. This encounter initiated a deeper understanding between them, pushing Steve toward his first real act of courage on Claire's behalf. The gold plating on the pistols was etched with the ancient crest of the House of Ashford, a detailed design that integrated with the key slots on the Grand Manor doors. Claire checked the weight of the guns, noticing that their firing pins had been removed to ensure they remained purely ceremonial assets. Steve watched her handle the metal, his defensive stance shifting into a quiet admiration for her mechanical precision. They left the study together, Their survival partnership finally stabilized after a near-fatal error that proved the company's traps didn't care about their personal arguments. The mechanism inside the wall was a complex layout of gears and brass counterweights, a historical piece of engineering that relied on the physical displacement of the firearms to hold the ceiling in place. Alfred had modified the original design to integrate with his electronic defense grid, turning a simple family treasure into a lethal security barrier against his corporate peers. Steve's greed had blinded him to the obvious warning lines painted on the floor tiles, a mistake that nearly ended his breakout before it could begin. He stayed close to Claire now, his tone dropping its defensive edge as they navigated the upper terrace paths toward the next layer of the nightmare. They could hear the sound of distant secondary explosions coming from the fuel depot near the docks, the orange glare reflecting off the wet marble of the terrace steps. The antique weapons were their only ticket out of the residential sector, their presence required to unlock the security bulkheads that led toward the military aircraft hangars. Claire secured the heavy pistols in her pack, her mind mapping the fastest route through the gardens, while the wind drove the cold rain against her jacket. They were no longer just two individuals running from separate pasts. They were a functional unit moving against a corporate fortress. Steve checked his ammunition one last time, his movements showing a new discipline that he'd learned from their close call inside the study. They reached the Grand Manor gates, the gold trim of the lugers matching the polished brass slots on the iron columns, ready for the path ahead. Part 21. Meeting Wesker. Claire walked into the large hall, searching for an alternate exit path. Before she could scan the stone floor, a powerful figure blindsided her and slammed her body against the wall. It was her first historic confrontation with Albert Wesker, the mortal nemesis of her brother. The rogue captain utilized his supernatural speed to pin her by the throat, cutting off her breath instantly. She couldn't break his iron hold, her muscles completely useless against his unnatural strength. Wesker didn't finish her off right there, choosing to drop her to the floor instead. He looked down at her with total detachment, his face completely unbothered by her presence. He openly mocked her as a useless piece of bait, a simple tool to draw his real target into the open. Her life ranked extremely low on his priority list, an insignificance compared to his upcoming goals. He wanted Chris to learn she was trapped here, knowing the news would force a rescue attempt. The captain relished the joy of letting Chris march directly into his upcoming Antarctic trap. He'd structured his entire operation around this personal vendetta, using the island as a starting point. Claire gasped for air on the floor, her throat bruised from his hand. She realized this man wasn't a normal human anymore, his presence radiating a strange power. His voice carried a calm weight that terrified her more than the burning facility outside. He spoke of Chris with a deep malice that had grown since the mansion incident. He wanted his old subordinate to witness the full collapse of everything he loved. Claire tried to raise her handgun, but her fingers shook from the intense pressure of the impact. Wesker didn't even glance at the weapon, his attention already turning toward the exit doors. He walked away alive, leaving her in the dust of the hall. The room felt colder after he left, the heavy silence returning to the space. Claire pulled herself up against a shattered case, her breath ragged. She understood that her brother was in extreme danger if he came to this island. The conspiracy had expanded far beyond a simple company, involving rogue agents with godlike power. She hadn't expected his survival after the mansion disaster. She needed to find Steve and locate an aircraft before Wesker's plan reached its conclusion. She checked her remaining gear, her survival instinct overriding the throbbing pain in her chest. She couldn't allow herself to become the submissive bait he wanted. The encounter confirmed that the company's old networks were falling apart, replaced by a shadowy syndicate that operated in the dark. She stepped past the broken statues, her determination hardening as she left the hall behind. Part 22. Wesker's new abilities observed. During the brief encounter, Claire witnessed Wesker move with an extreme velocity that completely defied natural biology. He didn't just run, he blurred across the floor, his body shifting faster than the human eye could follow. When she lunged forward with her combat knife, he easily dodged her close-range strikes without breaking his stance. It was an impossible display of speed that left her completely defenseless in the center of the room. She couldn't have possibly understood that his cells were actively processing an experimental pathogen. The substance had rewritten his genetic code after his apparent death in the mountains, granting him physical attributes that surpassed any biological benchmark. He was a human bioweapon, a successful integration of science and flesh that didn't suffer from the standard mutations of the old strains. He controlled the infection completely, maintaining his cognitive functions while his tissue gained a dense durability. Claire was horrified by his glowing eyes and unnatural strength, features that he usually hid behind dark sunglasses. The crimson irises reflected the fire from the corridor, a visual confirmation that he'd cast aside his old humanity. When he gripped her shoulder, the pressure nearly cracked her collarbone, showing a force that could crush stone. The old files weren't accurate anymore. She realized that the reports about his demise were completely wrong. She immediately recorded the data in her mind, analyzing his movements with a tactical focus. She knew that if Chris encountered this creature without a proper warning, he wouldn't survive the first exchange. The captain was no longer a crooked cop with a badge. He was an apex predator with a grudge. She needed to find a functional terminal to relay this information before the island's infrastructure collapsed completely. She managed to pass a high-priority warning to Chris the moment she established an emergency data link later that night. She uploaded the security footage of the hall, her fingers flying across the keyboard as the terminal's power flickered. She described his accelerated movement and his red eyes, begging her brother to avoid a direct confrontation if he reached the facility. It wasn't a clean connection, but it's a sister's desperate attempt to protect her remaining family. The link severed right after the upload completed, the monitor turning black as the secondary generators failed. Claire stood in the dark room, the silence heavy around her. She'd done everything she could to balance the layout for her brother. Now, she had to focus on her own escape, knowing that Wesker was still hunting somewhere on the ridges above her. Part 23. The Training Facility. Claire and Steve breached the adjacent military training facility shortly after her escape from the palace. The complex wasn't a standard facility. It was a massive installation where corporate security personnel underwent live fire combat drills. The air inside was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and industrial coolant. The walls lined with targets and reinforced windows. It wasn't a warm environment, but a sterile space designed to turn regular contractors into efficient killers for the global market. They discovered that the facility was infested with bandersnatchers, grotesque mutations that had broken out during the air raid. These creatures weren't regular zombies. They were single-armed variants of the virus line, their bodies deformed by an uneven genetic distribution. They possessed an elastic appendage that could stretch across wide rooms to crush targets with incredible force. The monsters didn't move with a clean momentum, but their reach made them dangerous in open spaces. Claire watched a bandersnatch extend its arm across a catwalk, the muscle layer snapping like a whip against the iron railing. She didn't hesitate. diving behind a metal crate with her handgun raised as she targeted its exposed head. Steve fired a continuous burst from his automatic weapons, the bullets tearing through its pale tissue until the creature collapsed into the gutter. They couldn't afford to get trapped in these lanes, knowing more test subjects were loose. Internal corporate files recovered from the main terminal confirmed that the island was functioning as a primary training ground for global bioweapons. The documents didn't hide the truth, detailing the combat metrics of the various strains and listing the survival rates of the security units that fought them. Claire scrolled through the data sheets, her analytical focus uncovering the full scope of the company's logistics. They weren't just manufacturing pathogens. They were building an instructional framework to sell them to international buyers. The blueprints showed that the facility extended deep into the island's foundations, connected to secret laboratories beneath the residential sectors. Steve didn't want to waste time, checking the terminal's map layout as his fingers traced the route toward the lower yards. He wanted to find a vehicle or an alternate exit before the base's self-destruct sequence was initiated by the automatic systems. His defensive shell was still intact, but his eyes showed a growing anxiety as the sirens didn't stop wailing. They left the terminal room, their boots clicking against the bloody tiles as they stepped back into the corridor. The facility wasn't just a research center. It was a monument to institutional malice, a place where human lives weren't treated with respect, but as cheap data for a weapons brochure. Claire secured her remaining clips, her mind locked on the immediate mechanics of survival. They needed to clear the lower levels before the expanding fire cut off their path completely. Part 24. Steve kills his father. The emotional cost of the outbreak reached a horrific peak inside the facility's garage yards later that night. The yard wasn't a safe space. It was an open arena of broken concrete and abandoned trucks, the air heavy with the smell of leaking fuel. As Claire searched an ambulance for medical supplies, a zombified guard lunged from the shadows to bite her throat. The creature wore a torn uniform, its flesh grey and decaying from the virus line. Steve ran to intervene, his submachine guns raised to clear the target. He stopped dead in his tracks, his entire body locking up in absolute paralysis upon recognizing the monster's face. It wasn't a stranger, it was his own father, the low-level clerk whose corporate treason had brought them to this prison island. The man's eyes were milky and vacant, his jaw snapping with a blind hunger that didn't recognize his remaining son. As the creature advanced to kill Claire, ignoring the teenager's frantic shouts, Steve suffered a total psychological breakdown. His hands shook violently as his defensive exterior completely dissolved in a wave of raw grief. The father he resented wasn't a parent anymore, but a mindless predator moving forward to claim another victim in the dirt. Claire was pinned against the truck's rear doors, her weapon out of reach as the monster closed the gap. Steve raised his weapons, his vision blurred by tears as he locked his sights onto his father's chest. He didn't hesitate, firing a lethal barrage that echoed through the open yard like thunder. The high-caliber rounds tore through the decayed tissue, stopping the monster's momentum and throwing his body backward onto the gravel path. The silence that followed wasn't broken by any sound, except for empty casings hitting the floor. The teenager dropped his weapons and collapsed into the mud, sobbing hysterically as the reality of his action hit his mind. He'd spent months nursing a burning hatred for the man who'd caused his mother's death, but pulling the trigger destroyed his remaining illusions. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a child trapped in a corporate execution zone, forced to execute his own blood to save a civilian friend. Claire walked to his side, her hand resting gently on his leather vest. She didn't say a word, understanding that any formal comfort wouldn't mean anything in this layout. She picked up his dropped pistols, her face solemn as she waited for his breathing to stabilize. The company hadn't spared a single thing Steve possessed, turning his family line into a pile of spent ammunition. They stood in the freezing rain, the smoking guns, a silent testament to the human cost of Umbrella's commercial ambitions. Part 25. Nosferatu on the cliff. Tracking a secret lift down to the island's lowest cliffside catacombs, Claire encountered a different class of biological horror. The elevator groaned as it descended into the damp darkness, the air turning cold and thick with the scent of ancient rot. When the iron gates slid open, she stepped out onto a narrow stone ledge over the ocean. In the center of the platform stood Nosferatu, the monstrously mutated form of Alexander Ashford. Bound for 15 years in the darkness of the subterranean cells, the virus had twisted his aristocratic body into a grey entity. His limbs weren't normal, but elongated and distorted, his head covered by a heavy leather hood that his children had used to silence his screams. An exposed heart pulsed visibly against his ribs, a vulnerable center that remained his only human trait. Long, independent combat tentacles emerged from his back, snapping against the stone walls with a wild kinetic power. The creature excreted a highly volatile, poisonous purple gas from his open throat whenever he drew a breath. The toxic vapor rolled across the ledge, obscuring her vision and degrading her physical stamina within seconds. Claire pulled her vest over her face, her reflexes keeping her alert as the tentacles lunged to knock her off the cliff. This monster wasn't just an enemy. It served as a terrifying biological warning of what the virus did to an unstabilized involuntary host. Alexander hadn't been a brilliant researcher, but a mediocre scientist whose children turned him into the perfect canvas for their first viral experiment. They didn't care about his fatherly status, using his nervous system to test the mutation mechanics of the ant DNA. The symbiosis had failed, destroying his higher brain functions and leaving a blind predator that lived in perpetual agony beneath the palace. He lashed out with a frantic rage, his appendages seeking to destroy any living thing that entered his cage. Claire coordinated her defensive movement, tracking his exposed heart through her weapon's sights while dodging the gas clouds. She didn't waste her ammunition, firing 3 precise rounds into the fleshy valve until the impact caused the grey giant to stumble toward the edge of the platform. He delivered a low groan that echoed over the crashing waves below, his tentacles losing their kinetic velocity as his system began to fail. He fell backward into the dark abyss, his long imprisonment finally finished. The toxic gas slowly dissolved in the sea wind, leaving the ledge clear for her progress. Claire leaned against the lift console, her breath coming in short gasps as she processed the full layout of the family's secret history. The Ashfords weren't a noble house anymore, but an absolute house of horrors, a lineage that treated its own blood like disposable laboratory material. She checked her map data, knowing that the root of this infection lay deeper in their secondary facility. Part 26. The Antarctic Connection. Bypassing the ruined catacombs, Claire breached the inner sanctum of the main Ashford Palace estate on the ridge. The office wasn't a normal workspace, but an elegant library of dark wood and leather chairs, a stark contrast to the wet stone of the lower tunnels. She walked to the large desk, her fingers cold as she activated the terminal, and began searching through Alfred's private ledgers. She needed an official confirmation of their shipping lines to locate an alternate route. Sifting through the encrypted shipping manifests, she recovered high-level data streams that detailed the company's global logistics. The files didn't just list cargo. They showed a massive transfer of chemical equipment and cryogenic gear, directed toward a specific coordinates matrix in the far south. The destination wasn't a standard warehouse, but a pristine installation built beneath the ice sheets of Antarctica. Claire realized that the island base was just a transit hub for a much larger project. For the first time, Claire connected the pieces of the puzzle, her analytical focus decoding the secret files. She found medical records that documented the eugenics project from 1971, listing the genetic traits of the twins. The documents confirmed that the legendary Alexia Ashford wasn't a historical myth or a dead child, as the European board believed. She was a living biological weapon, currently sleeping inside a cryo chamber deep beneath the ice. The realization changed her definition of the immediate threat. The company wasn't just managing standard outbreaks. They were waiting for an intellectual monarch to awaken and claim her inheritance. Alexia's notes described a coordinated network that could overwrite human social structure, an ambition that matched her family's royal grandiosity. Claire copied the server data onto a portable drive, knowing this information was crucial for her brother's survival. Steve entered the office, his uniform soaked from the storm outside. He looked at the monitor screen, his face pale as he read the descriptions of the Sub-Zero facility. He didn't want to hear about more corporate secrets. His mind entirely focused on finding a functional aircraft before the base's security forces cornered them. He pointed toward the hangar icons on the screen, confirming that the island's transport plane was prepped for flight. Claire closed the ledger, her determination steady as she secured the data drive in her vest pocket. They had a clean destination now, but their window for a clean breakout wasn't wide. The sirens outside had dropped to a low drone, indicating that the power grids were failing across the residential sector. She followed Steve down the hidden staircase, her mind preparing for the final run through the hangar doors. Part 27. The Seaplane. Claire and Steve managed to secure a fully operational transport plane parked inside the island's private hangar bay. The aircraft wasn't a standard model. It was a massive vehicle designed for long flights over open water, its hull reinforced against ocean waves. Steve scrambled into the cockpit, his mechanical focus allowing him to initiate the engine sequence while Claire cleared the security blocks on the hangar doors. The twin propellers flared to life with a deafening roar, cutting through the damp air of the bay. As Steve taxied the aircraft down the flooded runway, Alfred executed a desperate trap from his command tower. He activated a terminal line that released a stored Tyrant model directly into the rear cargo hold. The creature wasn't a normal sample. It was a standard monster, its muscle layer enclosed in a restrictive coat designed to keep its mutation stable. The impact of its heavy footsteps shook the floor plating of the cabin as they climbed into the dark sky. The subsequent battle took place over an open cargo door mid-flight, the freezing wind tearing through the interior. Claire was forced to navigate the narrow spacing between the shipping crates, while the giant monster advanced to crush her throat. The creature's claws weren't normal, but massive, its movements slow but relentless as it ignored her handgun fire. She knew a single strike from its fist would throw her out into the open sky. Claire utilized her mechanical precision to operate a missile crate that sat on the loading rails. She didn't panic, bypassing the release switch and timing her movement perfectly. As the plane tilted in the storm, the heavy container shot forward down the metal track, striking the Tyrant directly in its chest with tremendous momentum. The force of the impact broke the monster's balance, throwing his massive body out into the ocean sky just as they thought they were free. The cargo doors hissed shut, cutting off the freezing wind and returning the cabin to a sudden quiet. Claire collapsed against the bulkheads, her fingers raw from the iron levers as she checked her remaining ammunition clips. They'd survived the company's pursuit weapon, a technical success that didn't leave her any room to rest. She walked up to the cockpit, sliding into the co-pilot's seat as Steve checked their altitude readings. The aircraft was flying steady above the storm clouds, the dark horizon expanding ahead of them. Steve delivered a brash grin, his defensive shell returning for a moment, as he told her that his flying skills had saved them from a permanent grave. Claire looked at the gold pistols resting on the console, her focus turning toward the future. They were finally clear of Rockfort Island, running toward an escape that they believed would lead them back to civilization. Jam Part 28. Alfred takes the controls. Their relief didn't last long before the aircraft's navigation monitors suddenly locked up. Sprinting to a fighter jet on the base runway back on the island, a heavily bleeding Alfred Ashford had activated an override code on Claire's seaplane mainframe. The dying commander wasn't thinking clearly, but his fingers were steady enough to execute the final security protocol. He refused to let the civilian prisoners escape his family's wrath, choosing to drag them into his sister's domain. From his cockpit screen, Alfred locked their navigation route onto an unbypassable course for Antarctica. The automated systems took complete control of the steering channels, ignoring Steve's frantic inputs on the control yoke. Alfred laughed maniacally into his headset as his own plane took off parallel to them, his voice a broken soprano that echoed through their cabin speakers. He watched their position marker shift on his radar tracker before he collapsed on his monitor screen, his life finally running out. Claire and Steve watched their flight monitors lock up, realizing their escape route had been transformed into a vector into the heart of the Ashford family's secondary nightmare. The controls weren't functional anymore, the displays flashing with warning lines that confirmed a total lockout of the manual systems. They were trapped inside an automated cage, flying at full speed toward the sub-zero continent without any way to alter their destination. Steve slammed his fists against the console, his temper flaring up as his defensive exterior cracked under the pressure. He'd spent his entire life running from corporate systems, and now a dead executive was directing his flight path. Claire checked the fuse boxes, trying to slice the wire bundles to disable the remote signal. But the company's engineers had blueprinted the mainframe with a thick casing that her knife couldn't penetrate. The atmospheric temperature inside the cabin began to drop as the aircraft adjusted its altitude for the long transit over the ocean. They looked out the cockpit glass, watching the dark waves disappear beneath a solid layer of grey clouds. They had enough fuel to reach the sub-zero continent, but they didn't have any winter gear or heavy clothing to survive the elements. The layout had shifted from an escape run into a forced convergence with the root of the virus program. Claire sat back in her chair, her hand resting on the data drive she'd secured in her vest. She knew that her brother would follow her trail to Rockfort Island, only to find a smoking graveyard. She had to remain stable for her companion, whose frantic breathing showed the depth of his internal anxiety. They flew onward into the winter night, the steady drone of the engines a continuous countdown toward their arrival at the Antarctic facility. Section 2, Chris on Rockfort Island, Part 29, Leon's Message. Earlier in the night, before her arrest in the computer labs, Claire had managed to route her real-time coordinate logs through a secure terminal to Leon S. Kennedy. She'd used a proxy connection to bypass the base's stationary radar lines, encryption keys protecting the data stream from immediate detection. Leon received the files in his Washington office, his new position providing him with a temporary window to access the mainframes without triggering an alarm. Operating under heavy surveillance in Washington, Leon utilized his clearance to securely transmit the hot zone data directly to Chris Redfield. He knew that his own movements were monitored by state handlers who wanted the conspiracy kept quiet, so he used an encrypted channel to route the message. He couldn't intervene personally without violating his contract, but he could balance the layout for his old partner. Armed with the definitive confirmation that his sister was actively alive and trapped inside a black site, Chris didn't hesitate for a single second. He'd spent 2 months following false leads across Europe, his frustration growing as the corporate lawyers scrubbed the archives. This single packet was the tool he needed, providing an exact matrix for his sister's location. He packed his tactical gear and left his safe house within an hour. Chris launched a solo tactical insertion via a stealth watercraft to breach the island's shores later that morning. He moved through the heavy surf under the cover of a dense fog, his military background allowing him to navigate the rocky cliffs without alerting the remaining guard towers. He didn't have a backup squad or an official mandate, operating as an independent operative who answered only to his own moral compass. The water wasn't warm as he dragged his boat onto the gravel beach, his tactical suit protecting his muscle layers from the cold temperature. He checked his combat rifle, chambering a round with a quiet precision that reflected his years of service. He knew that entering a black site alone wasn't a standard operation, but his sibling devotion made the risk entirely secondary. He looked up at the smoking ridges, ready to disassemble their security network from the inside. He monitored the internal radio frequencies using his tactical headset, noticing that the local garrison was completely silent. The lack of corporate chatter suggested that the base had already suffered a major breakdown before his arrival. He adjusted his pack, checked his flashlight lens, and climbed the steep mud paths toward the prison sector. His focus locked on finding the civilian girl he'd left behind in America. Part 30. The Ruined Island. Chris arrived on Rockfort Island hours after Claire's forced departure, finding the entire installation in a state of absolute, smouldering ruin. The air wasn't clean, thick with the suffocating scent of burning rubber and chemical propellant. The paths littered with the debris of the surprise raid. The perimeters had been completely shattered, the automated turret lines twisted into melted iron by the intensity of the concussive blasts. It was a war zone that lacked any central command structure. Wesker's forces had already completed their primary demolition runs and were preparing to evacuate for Antarctica when Chris breached the ridges. The stealth bombers had left a clean path of destruction through the barracks, ensuring that the local security forces couldn't coordinate a proper defense. Chris moved through the smoking rubble with a cautious step, his rifle raised as he evaluated the scattered bodies of the garrison. They weren't killed by bullets. Their tissue showed the distinct signs of viral exposure. Pushing through the prison cells of the complex, Chris discovered Rodrigo Raval slumped against a concrete wall. The veteran officer wasn't moving, coughing dark fluid from his lungs, his uniform soaked from a severe shrapnel wound that tore his side open. His eyes were dim, but his hand was steady as he raised a silver lighter toward the intruder. He recognized the family traits instantly, his voice a gravelly whisper in the dark room. Rodrigo used his final breaths to hand Chris the lighter Claire had given him as a thank you token earlier that night. He confirmed she had successfully flown off the island with Steve, escaping the initial slaughter of the cell blocks. The metal casing of the lighter was warm, a human connection inside a facility that had turned into a giant test tube. Chris secured the item in his vest, his face solemn as he listened to the guards' ragged breathing. The prison block wasn't noisy, the white steam from the broken pipes creating a dense fog that reduced his visibility to a few feet. Rodrigo's stance was relaxed against the masonry. his long contract with the pharmaceutical giant finally broken by an act of simple mercy. Chris tried to apply a medical dressing to his shoulder, but the veteran officer shook his head, telling him that his internal metrics had already dropped below the survival line. He told Chris that the commander had lost his mind completely, turning his weapons on his own personnel before the air raid completed. The entire base wasn't an asset anymore, but a hazardous trap designed to process visitors into corpses, and his sister was flying directly into the center of their network. Chris stood up, his focus hardening as he prepared to clear the lower levels, completely unaware that the concrete floor beneath his boots was about to rupture. Part 31. Rodrigo's final conversation. Before Rodrigo could finish detailing the exact destination of the seaplane, the concrete floor violently ruptured with a deafening crash. A gulp worm, a colossal experiment mutated by the virus line, breached the prison block from the lower maintenance tunnels. The monster was massive, its pale tissue covered in a thick layer of slimy mucus that protected its segments from the debris. Its circular jaw wasn't quiet, lined with rows of sharp teeth that snapped in the dark. The monster swallowed Rodrigo whole before Chris could chamber around or lock his sights onto its center. The sudden attack didn't take more than a second, the creature's momentum dragging the dying guard down into the broken masonry before the dust could settle. Chris shouted in rage, his tactical suit covered in wet dirt as he dove out of the path of its descending tail segment. He refused to let a brave man be processed as simple food. Chris pursued the beast into the courtyard, his boots sinking into the wet mud as the rain drove against his face. The creature breached the surface multiple times, its massive body tearing up the gravel paths as it tried to digest its meal. Chris didn't hold back, using heavy firearms to burst its internal segments and firing continuous bursts from his rifle into the soft joints of its carapace. Every hit released a stream of dark fluid, slowing the monster's velocity until it cornered itself against a transport truck. A final shot ruptured the central nerve ring, forcing the giant worm to violently vomit up Rodrigo's broken body onto the concrete. The creature delivered a low shudder and collapsed into the mud, its segments finally turning still as the viral engine failed. Chris ran to the officer's side, diving into the dirt to check his remaining pulse lines. Rodrigo was still conscious, his fingers twitching against the gravel surface. The proud officer died in Chris's arms a few moments later, his final validation being that he'd kept his promise to free the sister. He looked at the silver lighter in Chris's hand, a faint smile crossing his face before his eyes turned vacant in the cold rain. He'd broken his contract to remain a human being, a final performance that Chris respected with a quiet nod. He laid the body down on the paths, his focus turning toward the main control rooms. The storm was growing more violent, the wind driving the black smoke from the reactor wing across the open yard. Chris secured his rifle, his mind mapping the fastest route through the residence blocks to find a functional aircraft. Rodrigo's death confirmed that the company's managers weren't sparing anyone who handled their data sheets, leaving no witnesses behind. He stepped past the dead worm, his determination steady as he entered the inner sanctum of the palace. Part 32. Wesker on Rockfort. Chris breached the main island security control room, only to be instantly ambushed by Albert Wesker. This marked their first direct meeting since the 1998 Arclay laboratory explosion, a catastrophic event that both men had barely survived. Stunned to see his former captain standing before him alive, Chris reacted with pure combat instinct, swinging a heavy metal pipe directly at his head. Wesker didn't even flinch as the iron bar closed the gap, his eyes hidden behind his signature dark sunglasses. Utilizing his superhuman speed, He caught the steel bar with a single hand, laughing at Chris's visible shock before effortlessly throwing the elite soldier across the room into a glass console, demonstrating his absolute physical dominance. The impact shattered the display screens, sending a shower of sharp sparks across the terminal desk. Chris struggled to find his footing, his muscles aching from a kinetic force that no normal human could possibly generate. He looked up from the ruined equipment, his eyes tracking the captain, as Wesker adjusted his leather cuffs with a calm, regular precision. The strength displayed in that single throw was a terrifying revelation, proving that the man who had sold out stars was no longer bound by the regular limitations of human anatomy. He was something entirely different, a biological anomaly built on corporate secrets. Wesker stood over his former subordinate, his shadow stretching across the bloody floor tiles. He didn't draw a firearm, knowing that his physical capabilities were more than enough to handle any conventional resistance Chris could offer. His movements were fluid and measured, lacking the frantic adrenaline of a normal fighter. His breathing steady despite the structural fires consuming the walls around them. He looked down at the soldier with a cold amusement, treating the encounter like a brief distraction in his corporate schedule. The balance of power had shifted completely since their last deployment in the mountains. The rogue captain enjoyed the absolute confusion radiating from his old rival, a small validation for the prototype experiments he'd endured. He explained that his survival wasn't a miracle, but the intended result of calculated planning and a specialized viral strain. Chris gripped his sidearm, his knuckles white as he tried to recalibrate his tactical approach against an opponent who could catch metal bars out of the air. The situation was completely outside his previous hot zone experience, forcing him to realize that the company's research had advanced far beyond regular zombies. The control room was a wreck of smoke and flashing warning lights, the automated emergency systems continuing to log the destruction of the outer perimeters. Wesker stepped closer, the heels of his boots clicking against the broken glass with a steady rhythm that didn't match the chaotic sirens outside. He wanted Chris to feel the absolute weight of his failure, ensuring that the soldier understood just how irrelevant his military training had become. The institutional monster that had been born in the Arclay labs was standing right in front of him, wearing a tactical vest and a confident smile. Chris refused to let the psychological pressure break his focus, his independent character keeping his mind clear as he monitored the room for any potential opening. He knew that a direct physical exchange was a losing strategy, so he looked for an environmental asset he could exploit to tilt the layout. The fires were spreading toward the main server racks, creating a hazardous layer of white smoke that began to obscure the lens of the security cameras. He stayed low, his hand steady on his weapon, as he waited for the captain to make his final move. Part 33. What Wesker told Chris Pinning. Chris to the floor with a heavy boot, Wesker explicitly confirmed that Claire had been remotely routed to the Antarctic base, mocking the siblings' predictability. He explained that her transport plane was already flying over the Southern Ocean, its navigation systems locked onto a direct course that she couldn't alter from the cabin terminal. Wesker boastfully revealed that he had cast aside his human identity to serve a powerful new corporate employer, a shadowy syndicate that wanted to break Spencer's market monopoly. He confirmed that Alexia Ashford was actively waking up from her cryogenic stasis, a biological event that would reshape the global weapons trade. The news about his sister hit Chris with a concussive force, his focus immediately turning toward the frozen continent. Wesker explained that the family's eugenics project was the real target of his raid, a pristine asset that would allow his new backers to build an advanced weapons division. He looked down at the soldier, his voice dropping to a low whisper as he described the properties of the Veronica strain, treating the nightmare like a simple transaction. He didn't care about the civilian lives that had been processed on the island, viewing the destruction as regular overhead. The captain's dark sunglasses slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the glowing red irises that confirmed his viral integration. Chris watched the crimson light reflect in the smoke, a terrifying visual marker of the transformation his former commander had undergone. Wesker explained that the House of Ashford was a broken lineage, its remaining heirs too unstable to manage the power their grandfather had pulled from the African flower. He intended to clean out their vaults before the rest of the world noticed the collapse of the base, triggering a remote, localized explosive to block Chris's pursuit. Wesker made a swift exit toward his waiting host capture force submarine. The blast tore through the main support columns, dropping a mountain of concrete and twisted iron between the two rivals within a single second. The concussive wave threw Chris backward into the hallway, the thick dust blinding his vision as the ceiling began to buckle under the weight of the ridge. The path to the docks was completely sealed, leaving him isolated inside a structure that was actively coming apart. The speaker system clicked off, cutting the captain's manic laughter out of the audio feed. Chris pulled himself out of the rubble, coughing the grey plaster from his lungs as he checked his tactical vest for damage. He had an exact coordinates matrix now, but his time to act was narrowing down to a few hours. The information from his enemy confirmed that the conspiracy was no longer confined to a single Midwestern town, having expanded into a multi-faction war that spanned multiple continents. He stood up in the darkened corridor, the heat from the lower laboratories rising through the floor ventilation grating. He knew he couldn't let his personal resentment toward Wesker slow down his transition to the next phase of the mission. His sister was flying directly into a frozen slaughterhouse, and he was the only operative who had a clear chance of intercepting the delivery. He adjusted his rifle strap, checked his remaining ammunition clips, and marched toward the island's private airfield. Part 34. The Harrier Jet. With the island's foundations actively buckling under structural fires, Chris sprinted to the base's military airport sector. The path wasn't clear, the gravel lanes choked with burning transport trucks and reanimated security dogs that lunged through the smoke lanes. Chris used short, precise bursts from his rifle to clear his spacing, his spatial focus allowing him to navigate the obstacles without losing his forward momentum. He could feel the ground shaking beneath his boots, indicator that the main fuel tanks were reaching their thermal limits. He breached the primary hangar doors, locating an abandoned vertical takeoff Harrier fighter jet parked on the central maintenance lift. The aircraft was a pristine piece of tactical gear, its carbon fiber hull unbothered by the air raid that had destroyed the surrounding warehouses. Chris scrambled into the cockpit, his military background allowing him to rapidly decipher the layout of the instruments and launch the pre-flight checklists. He flipped the fuel pumps, the heavy turbines flaring to life with a deafening whine that drowned out the sirens. The instruments settled into a steady green matrix, the computer banks loading the navigation logs left behind by the fleeing personnel. Chris locked his arrays onto the exact Antarctic tracking data that his sister's seaplane had generated before the signal failed. He threw the throttle forward, the vertical thrusters lifting the jet through the open hangar roof, just as a massive primary explosion obliterated the lower service bays. He climbed into the morning sky, leaving a ruined colony behind him. His flight ran perfectly parallel to the trajectory of Wesker's stealth submarine, setting up a multi-faction convergence in the frozen south. The aircraft cut through the winter clouds at a high velocity, the automated stabilization systems handling the turbulent air over the open ocean. Chris stared at the horizon, his calm face showing no emotion as he calculated his arrival time. He knew that the sub-zero environment would offer a different class of hazard, where a single equipment failure meant an instant death sentence. The cabin was quiet compared to the burning yards of the base, the steady hum of the engine providing a regular rhythm for his thoughts. He checked the silver lighter he'd secured from Rodrigo, its polished surface a reminder of the human cost that this company exacted from its workers. He didn't let the grief turn into a distraction, focusing his mind on the immediate mechanics of landing a tactical aircraft on an ice shelf. The company's reach had extended to the bottom of the world, and he was flying right behind them. The radar screen showed nothing but open water for the first 2 hours, the digital sweep matching the absolute isolation of his position. Chris checked his thermal switches, ensuring the cockpit heaters were working at maximum capacity to keep his fingers from turning brittle before the insertion. He was a lone operative moving against a corporate dynasty, his resources non-existent compared to the arsenal his enemy commanded. He watched the temperature display drop as the first icebergs broke through the cloud deck below. Section 3, Antarctica, Part 35, the Antarctic Umbrella Facility. The Umbrella Antarctic Transport Facility was a colossal, multi-tiered industrial complex constructed deep beneath the shelf ice. Built in the early 1970s to process sub-zero chemical compounds, the base had been largely abandoned by administrative staff following Alexander's sudden disappearance. The architecture was a grim layout of reinforced concrete and rusted iron pipes, designed to withstand the extreme pressure of the shifting ice sheets. It wasn't a laboratory in the aesthetic sense, but an industrial factory that handled lethal patents in the dark. The automated clean rooms and server arrays remained fully functional despite the lack of a living garrison, their systems managed by a central mainframe. The lower levels were completely dark, the absolute cold preserving the machinery in a state of suspended animation until an administrative code woke the circuits. Deep within the lowest cryogenic laboratory sat the pristine stasis chamber, housing the world's most dangerous biological secret. It was a cold tomb built to protect a family's vanity, cut off from the main corporate directory. The facility managed the logistics for their entire southern network, shipping raw viral materials to Rockfort Island for tactical combat testing. The workers who had run the drills before the abandonment left their diaries behind, their entries documenting a growing dread as the twins grew more erratic. They noticed that the children handled lethal pathogens with a casual indifference, treating the staff like simple factory material. The entire base was a monument to corporate negligence, a place where safety protocols were secondary to the family's lineage goals. The ventilation shafts were choked with frost, the white ice crystals sparkling against the iron grates in the dim emergency lighting. The localized infection had leaked through the primary seals during Alfred's frantic arrival, moving through the lower barracks before the security doors could drop. The automated systems had triggered a partial quarantine, but the seals were too old to hold the strain, allowing the pathogen to degrade the remaining infrastructure. It was a sterile maze, waiting for a visitor to trip its sensors. The storage units were filled with old manifests that detailed the financial stake the family held in the pharmaceutical monopoly. Alexander had spent millions building these sub-zero clean rooms, completely burning through his family fortune to keep Spencer from discovering his eugenics program. The result was a divided facility, where pristine research suites sat adjacent to dark disposal pits where failed subjects were dumped. The architecture reflected the rot of the bloodline, a high-tech fortress built on top of a graveyard. Chris monitored the structural readings from his cockpit display, as he approached the continental ridge, the radar mapping the hidden shafts. He could see the main exhaust vents breaking through the snow dunes, their black smoke an indicator that the facility's generators were still running. He knew that entering an isolated installation without a tactical map was an extreme risk, but his sibling devotion left him no alternate layout. He checked his rifle, locked his landing gear, and prepared to breach the ice. Part 36, Claire and Steve's arrival. Claire and Steve's transport plane suffered a violent crash landing directly through the glass skylights of the main transport terminal, stranding them in a sub-zero nightmare. The impact sheared off the vehicle's wings, throwing the heavy hull across the ice-slicked floor of the arrival bay until it slammed into a concrete support column. The cabin structure groaned as the metal buckled, the glass windows shattering into thousands of sharp fragments that rained down on the deck. The absolute cold entered the cabin instantly, dropping the temperature within a few seconds. The localized virus leak from Alfred's arrival had already zombified the remaining skeleton crew, freezing their dead flesh into brittle, animated ice corpses. These monsters didn't move with the regular fluidity of the Midwestern ghouls, their joints snapping with a loud crack as they forced their limbs through the frost layers. They tracked the sound of the crash with a blind momentum, their blue fingers reaching through the broken windshield of the plane. Claire scrambled out of the wreckage, her boots slipping on the frozen fuel pools. The two teenagers were forced to fight through an entirely different class of environmental horror, conserving their thermal resources as the sub-zero cold rapidly degraded their physical stamina. Their civilian clothing offered no protection against the extreme elements, their breath forming thick clouds of white steam that reduced their operational visibility. Steve fired his submachine guns with stiff fingers, the bullets hitting the frozen targets with a dull thud that echoed through the massive terminal hall. They couldn't afford to slow down, knowing that hypothermia would freeze their muscle layers before the ghouls could close the gap. The arrival bay was a ruin of broken iron scaffolding and scattered luggage, the emergency lights casting long shadows across the frost-covered walls. Claire found a simple maintenance map near a security gate, her analytical focus allowing her to locate the primary heating controls 2 floors below. She checked her companion, noticing that his brash attitude had been completely replaced by a grim focus as he watched the ice corpses advance down the stairs. They were out of options, trapped inside a cold cage that lacked any clean escape routes. The mechanical infrastructure of the base was actively failing under the strain of the crash, the broken pipes leaking steam that froze into dangerous icicles before it hit the floor. Claire managed to secure a basic hunting rifle from a storage locker, her hands raw from the cold metal as she chambered around. She stayed behind Steve, her movement steady as they breached the first security door to escape the open terminal yard. They needed to find a warm sanctuary before their internal metrics dropped below the survival line. The isolation was absolute, the sound of the wind howling through the shattered skylights above a continuous reminder that no rescue squad was coming. They moved deeper into the dark office blocks, their steps slow as they rationed their remaining flashlight batteries. Every room they passed was an archive of corporate decay, where desks were covered in ice and files were frozen solid inside their iron drawers. They were 2 fugitives navigating a corporate tomb at the bottom of the world. Part 37. Alfred's final moments. Suffering from fatal internal bleeding from his previous battles with Claire on Rockfort Island, a dying Alfred Ashford dragged his body across the freezing laboratory floors. His customized uniform was torn and soaked in dark blood, his heavy steps leaving a trail of red stains on the pristine white tiles of the corridor. He was completely blind to the alarms flashing on the walls, his fading consciousness entirely focused on reaching the inner sanctum of the facility. He staggered through the security bulkheads, his breath a ragged gasp that rattled in his throat. He finally reached his sister's central cryogenic pod, his fingers trembling as he touched the frozen glass viewport. He managed to execute the final manual security release sequence on the console array, his blood smearing the electronic keys as his strength failed. The automated valves hissed as the sub-zero fluid drained from the tank, the cryogenic fog rolling across his face as the primary doors slid open. Alexia emerged from the mist, her youth perfectly preserved by the 15-year stasis cycle she'd engineered. The young matriarch cradled her twin brother's head as he died directly at her feet, her expression remaining calm and detached. Alfred's final act was entirely focused on her perfection, his hand reaching for her lace collar to verify her survival before his eyes turned vacant. He'd spent his entire adult life living inside a theatrical illusion to protect her secret, and his final reward was a quiet death in her arms. Alexia didn't shed a single tear for his sacrifice, looking down at his body like a tool that had completed its run. She responded by humming their childhood lullaby while watching Claire's escape snowmobile burn on her security monitor screen. The melody was a soft soprano that filled the sterile room, a bizarre contrast to the automated evacuation alerts that continued to flash on the overhead panels. She watched the civilian girl navigate the outer courtyard through the lens of her cameras, her focus calculated and relaxed. Her brother's demise didn't alter her emotional layout, serving only as an indicator that the intruders had breached her perimeter. The dead executive lay on the floor tiles, his military fantasy finished, while his sister stepped over his boots to claim her position. The room was quiet except for her humming, the central mainframe recording his clinical death, with a simple, automated text entry. Alfred had saved the family's prestige at the cost of his own sanity, leaving a legacy of madness that Alexia intended to weaponize against the corporate world. She adjusted her dress, her movements slow and deliberate as she prepared to exit the laboratory. The automated systems closed his file, the screen displaying a clean layout that lacked any human metrics. Alexia didn't look back at the tank, her mind already tracking the structural layers of her facility to locate the remaining targets. Her sleep was finished, and the planet's resources were waiting for her command. She stepped through the sliding doors, her silhouette disappearing into the white fog of the corridor as the automated locks engaged behind her. Part 38. Alexia Awakens. Alexia Ashford stood up after 15 years of voluntary cryosleep, having achieved absolute cellular symbiosis with the Veronica virus. Her mind remained completely uncompromised by the long stasis, keeping her cold, aristocratic intelligence while her muscle tissue gained a supernatural kinetic durability. She looked down at her hands, her skin smooth and unbothered by the passage of time, her veins pulsing with a fluid that could ignite upon contact with air. She was the successful result of her father's eugenics program, an intellectual monarch who lacked any human empathy. Armed with the absolute certainty that she was the rightful biological sovereign of the planet, she looked at the facility's monitors. She viewed human society as an obsolete branch of evolution, an inefficient system that could be easily disassembled by a single coordinated mind. Her 15 years inside the cryogenic fog had allowed her cortex to internalize the viral strands, turning her consciousness into the central node of a living world. She didn't feel a shard of fear as the facility shook from a distant explosion. She raised her hand, telepathically commanding the massive subterranean root networks beneath the ice to violently breach the floors to capture the intruders. The ancient plant code inside her blood allowed her to project her thoughts into the organic infrastructure of the base, turning the environment into an extension of her own nervous system. The heavy wooden roots tore through the concrete foundations within a single second, their dense fibers snapping the iron pipes like dry twigs as they rose to secure her perimeter. Claire and Steve were caught in the middle of the courtyard as the stone deck buckled beneath their feet. The roots moved with an accelerated velocity that ignored the physical constraints of regular flora, their appendages locking around the teenagers' limbs before they could raise their firearms. Alexia watched their struggle from her high gallery, her face showing nothing but a calm approval as her organic network completed the extraction. The targets were handled like simple raw material for her upcoming terminal project. The facility's automated defense systems were completely bypassed by this biological intervention, the electronic grids logging errors as the root layers crushed the wiring conduits. Alexia didn't need Spencer's security squads or Alfred's irregular garrison to protect her domain, her telepathic links providing a direct command line over every mutation track inside the base. She walked down the central staircase, her aristocratic gown brushing against the wet wood of the appendages that lined the walls. The sub-zero air didn't degrade her physical stamina. Her metabolic rate adjusted to maintain her body temperature without requiring artificial heaters. She stood in the center of the atrium, her red eyes reflecting the emergency lights as she evaluated her new assets. The countdown she'd started in 1983 had finally reached zero, and the new species was ready to take its place at the top of the corporate ledger. Part 39. Alexia's first actions. Alexia utilized massive subterranean viral tentacles to effortlessly capture Claire and Steve, dragging them down into the lowest antennae chambers of the facility. The space was a massive cavern of ice and raw rock, dominated by the colossal root structures that she'd grown beneath the shelf ice. The air carried the sharp scent of old sap and frozen soil, the absolute darkness broken only by the blue glow of her viral arrays. She ordered her appendages to bind the teenagers to the central pillars, their leather straps securing them against the stone. Driven by a god complex that made her the most dangerous Ashford in history, she viewed the human prisoners as primitive test subjects for her metrics. She didn't see Claire's tears or hear Steve's angry shouts. Looking at their frantic movements with the same analytical focus a researcher would extend to laboratory mice. Her father's old journals had detailed how regular networks rejected the pathogen, and she wanted to observe the exact mechanics of that genetic failure at scale. She selected a heavy syringe from her clean desk. She immediately subjected Steve to a horrific eugenics experiment, forcibly injecting his central nervous system with a raw high-dose sample of the T. Veronica virus. The long needle entered his vascular channels with a clinical precision, the green fluid entering his blood before his immune system could mount a defense. Alexia stood back to observe how a young, unstabilized host would react to its evolutionary traits, her clipboard ready to record the initial cellular shifts on her monitor screen. The teenager's body reacted instantly to the pathogen, his muscle layer twitching violently as his heart rate spiked beyond the safe limits. Steve screamed in agony, the sound echoing through the cavernous vaults as the viral strands began to rewrite his genetic code. Alexia watched his vascular channels turn dark beneath his skin, her face showing a calm satisfaction as the insect DNA integrated with his tissue. She didn't offer any medical treatment, letting the infection run its natural course through his nerves. Claire tried to break her bonds, her fingers raw from pulling against the heavy roots that held her waist against the concrete column. She begged the researcher to stop the test, but Alexia ignored her voice entirely, her focus locked on tracking the data streams that updated on her console display. The experiment wasn't an act of personal cruelty. but a regular scientific investigation designed to calibrate the virus distribution models for her upcoming global deployment. When the initial mutation cycle settled, Steve's breathing dropped to a low rattle, his body hanging from the iron restraints as his skin began to turn grey. Alexia recorded the final metrics, verified the chemical balance of his blood, and left the chamber without saying a word. She'd completed the first layer of her research, leaving the civilian girl alone in the dark to witness the final transformation of her companion. Part 40, Claire. Alone in the facility, Claire awoke bound inside a dark detention cell, completely stripped of her support. The roots that had secured her during the initial capture had withered from the sub-zero air, leaving her free to move, but isolated inside a frozen labyrinth that lacked any emergency lighting. Her leather jacket was torn, her hands numb from the cold, as she navigated the narrow corridors of the transport tier. She didn't have her handgun or her knife, her survival based entirely on her spatial focus and her quick reflexes. Navigating the frozen labyrinth of Antarctica without Steve, she faced hyper-aggressive biological weapons that Alexia had produced during her long stasis. She breached a clean room, only to be ambushed by albinoids, mutated electrical salamander anomalies that moved through the flooded floor lanes with a rapid kinetic velocity. The water carried a continuous current that degraded her stamina, forcing her to execute rapid evasion maneuvers to reach the safety of the upper catwalks. The environment was an active trap designed to process intruders. The deeper sections were infested with giant toxic spiders that had integrated with the plant cells of the facility, their webs thick and heavy across the security doors. Claire managed to find a heavy iron pipe near a broken valve, using the tool to clear her path through the sticky fibers before the predators could capture her silhouette. She didn't let the terror alter her focus, her mind locked on finding the primary laboratory terminal to locate her missing companion. Corporate journals recovered from the clean rooms confirmed that T. Veronica was engineered to overwrite human social structure entirely, forcing a queen dynamic down the throat of the population. The files explained that the virus built an advanced pheromone network that allowed a single leader to control every individual worker without requiring automated security panels. This revelation clarified the scale of the threat, proving that Alexia wasn't looking to sell bioweapons to military buyers, but wanted to manage the planet's ecosystem directly. Claire stuffed the technical logs into her vest, her independent character allowing her to handle the absolute isolation of the hot zone. She knew that her companion was undergoing a horrific transformation inside the lower ritual chambers, his countdown running out while she searched for a weapon. She found an automated elevator that was still running on backup batteries, its screen flashing with security alerts that indicated a major structural breakdown in the sectors below. She descended into the industrial wings, her fingers gripping the metal pipe as the doors slid open to reveal a dark loading bay. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning insulation, an indicator that the main generators were reaching their breakdown limits. She stepped onto the icy deck, her senses alert for any sound that didn't match the natural rhythm of the sub-zero wind that howled through the ventilation shafts. Part 41. Chris arrives in Antarctica. Chris Redfield executed a flawless tactical landing with his Harrier jet, breaching the facility's outer hangar perimeters under the cover of a dense blizzard. He taxied the aircraft down the ice-covered runway, the twin engines slowing to a stop as he secured his tactical gear and checked his primary combat rifle. He stepped out onto the frozen shelf, his boots sinking into the thick snow as he evaluated the massive structures that broke through the dunes ahead. The air was dead quiet, an indicator that the garrison had already collapsed. Stepping into the central atrium of the complex, he found an interior layout, whose structural grandiosity directly mirrored the Spencer Mansion's main hall. The sweeping staircases, the marble columns, and the ornate paintings were an exact replica of the Arklay estate, a sterile theatre built to satisfy the family's historical fantasies. The familiar chilling architecture signaled to Chris that the Ashford legacy was inextricably linked to the same viral nightmare he had fought in 1998, forcing him to move with extreme caution. The architecture wasn't just a design choice, but a functional maze built to funnel intruders into specific kill zones where the central mainframe could monitor them. Chris tracked the lens of the stationary security cameras, using his tactical focus to spot their blind spots before moving down the long galleries. He noticed that the walls were covered in thick root layers that had broken through the concrete, the organic fibers pulsing with a dull chemical light that suggested an active biological presence. The similarity to his past hot zones increased his alertness, his fingers steady on the grip of his weapon as he cleared the first row of office doors. He found several corporate manifests that documented Wesker's arrival at the Deepwater port, confirming that his former captain was actively clearing the vaults to secure the virus data. The layout had turned into a multi-faction race where a single error meant an instant death sentence inside the ice. Chris used his tactical headset to scan the local radio frequencies, but he encountered nothing but a high-frequency telepathic static that rattled his earpieces. He realized that the base was under the direct control of a single consciousness that didn't rely on electronic channels to coordinate its assets. This biological control was a different direction in viral engineering, an asset that turned the entire facility into a single living organism that answered to a queen. He reached the upper balcony, his eyes capturing a trail of red footprints that led down into the lower prison tiers. The stains were old, the blood frozen solid against the marble tiles, but the path was a clear indicator that someone had been dragged into the dark sectors below the hall. Chris adjusted his pack, verified his ammunition levels, and descended into the dark stone tunnels, his mind entirely focused on finding his sister before her countdown expired. Part 42. The Reunion. Chris tracked Claire's emergency tracking beacon to the lower prison tiers, using his combat knife to slice through the withered root layers that blocked the cell gate. He threw open the iron door, finding his sister wrapped in heavy restraints, but unbothered by any permanent physical trauma. The Redfield siblings shared a frantic, deeply emotional embrace, marking a mutual accounting of what each had lost and survived, just to stand in the same room again. The long months of isolation and false leads disappeared in that single afternoon. The relief was instantly undercut by intense panic, as Claire explained that Steve was still completely missing inside the lower ritual chambers. She told Chris about the eugenics experiment Alexia had initiated on the teenager, her voice shaking as she described the green fluid that had entered his veins. Chris checked his weapon, his tactical focus allowing him to calibrate their plan to include a rapid extraction operation for the captive companion before his system failed. Claire led her brother deeper into the facility's dark industrial wings, her familiarity with the layout providing a direct line through the maze of server rooms. The air turned warm as they descended toward the lower levels, the hum of the main reactor units increasing until the floor plates began to vibrate against their boots. They passed several laboratory booths that had been crushed by the expanding roots, the broken glass littering the gravel paths of the maintenance shafts. They moved with extreme caution, knowing that Wesker's host capture force operators were actively tracking the same data streams from the main terminal suites. Chris kept his rifle raised to cover their spacing, his military experience balancing his sister's mechanical precision as they cleared the final security checkpoint. The sirens had stopped wailing, replaced by a low, high-frequency drone that filled the corridor like a physical weight, indicating that the Queen was close. The bond between the siblings was their strongest asset in this tactical disaster, their mutual trust allowing them to coordinate their movements without requiring written scripts. They crossed a wide assembly bay, the abandoned cargo containers providing excellent cover against any stationary defense turrets that Alfred had left behind. Claire pointed toward a large steel door at the end of the line, confirming it led directly to the central ritual hall. Chris took a position near the hydraulic switch, his hand steady on the lever as he signaled for his sister to verify her weapon. They had no margin for error, their individual pasts completely secondary to the immediate logistics of breaching the inner sanctum before the viral integration reached its final layout. He pulled the iron handle, the heavy door hissing open to reveal the darkness of the terminal room ahead. Part 43. Steve's Mutation. Claire located Steve bound to a stone chair in a central ritual chamber, but the high-dose T Veronica injection had already completed its violent work. His human cellular structure ruptured, mutating him into a gargantuan green reptilian giant, wielding a massive jagged executioner's axe. Controlled by Alexia's telepathic frequency, the monster relentlessly attacked Claire, cornering her inside a narrow detention cell. At the absolute last second, Steve's core human consciousness miraculously broke through the viral fog, causing him to turn his massive weapon around to sever Alexia's controlling tentacles instead. The transformation was an absolute tragedy of biological engineering, turning a defensive teenager into a mindless predator that fought against its own nature. His skin had hardened into thick, armored scales that shivered under the strain of the pathogen. Claire watched in horror as he fought to reclaim his own movements, his massive form trembling as he resisted the telepathic commands of the Queen. The ritual chamber was silent, save for the wet, heavy breathing of the monster and the distant crackle of the base's dying generators. Steve's axe was a heavy, rusted piece of equipment that he had used during the base's security drills, now wielded with a terrifying kinetic force. He slashed the air, his reptilian eyes struggling to focus on the human target in the cell. Claire didn't raise her weapon, understanding that he wasn't the enemy, but a victim of the same family history that had produced the monster in the cryogenic tank. She stayed still, her focus locked on his shifting pupils as the viral control weakened. The moment of clarity came when he brought the heavy axe down with a thunderous impact, missing her body by an inch to strike the floor instead. He roared a low, guttural sound that carried a shred of his original identity, his hand twitching as he severed the purple vine that snaked toward her from the ceiling. Alexia screamed from the gallery, the loss of her telepathic node forcing her to recoil. Steve had broken the hive mind through a sheer act of will. He slumped against the stone pillar, his massive body shrinking as the mutation began to retreat. The cost of that psychic battle was immediate and severe, the pathogen tearing through his remaining healthy tissue in a final, lethal feedback loop. Claire rushed to his side, her hands pressing against his cold, scaled skin as he tried to speak. He was a teenager who had been forced to play a role in a corporate script, and he had finally ripped the page out. The chamber grew cold as the emergency vents opened, the frost forming on the stone floor near his feet. Claire held him while he fought the last waves of the fever, her heart breaking as she watched the monster vanish for good. He was human again, his eyes finally clearing as he looked at her with a quiet, exhausted relief. The facility felt empty and silent, the weight of the Ashford legacy finally crushing the life out of the last victim of their research. Part 44. Alexia's Mortal Wound. In immediate retaliation for his betrayal, Alexia delivered a crushing, mortal blow to Steve's chest using a massive bone-plated viral tentacle. As the monster collapsed, the parasite's hold dissolved, reverting Steve back into his normal human form on the cold cell floor. He died directly in Claire's arms, whispering a tragic final confession of love before his eyes rolled back. Claire was left emotionally devastated, carrying a deep, psychological weight out of Antarctica that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate viruses, permanently altering her view on the human cost of bioterrorism. The blow had been calculated and cold, designed to punish the Queen's loss of control with a final, lethal strike. Alexia stood over them, her silhouette framed by the blue light of the viral arrays, her expression showing no flicker of pity for the boy she had engineered into a weapon. She viewed the death as a simple waste of inventory, a minor setback in her long-term plan to reshape the ecosystem. Claire didn't look up, her face buried in Steve's jacket as she felt the last heat leave his body. The silence that filled the chamber was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that felt like the ice above the facility. Claire felt the loss like a sharp blade, the reality of the island's cruelty finally sinking into her consciousness. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a witness to a crime that the company would never acknowledge in their official reports. She laid his head down on the floor, her movements slow and mechanical as she stood up to face the researcher. Alexia watched her with a calm, predatory curiosity, waiting for the girl to break under the pressure of the moment. She didn't expect Claire to stand, assuming the grief would keep her trapped in the detention cell, while the self-destruct countdown finished its cycle. The Queen was a creature who lacked a shred of human empathy, her mind currently mapping the coordinates for the rest of the world. She turned away, her gown sweeping against the stone as she walked back toward the central lift. Claire stood alone in the dark, her face set in an expression of cold, unyielding resolve. The loss had stripped away her remaining hesitation, replacing it with a singular focus that Alexia couldn't predict. She wasn't a soldier or a spy, but she was a sister who had witnessed the company's ultimate betrayal of the next generation. She checked the doorframe, her hand finding a hidden override switch that would lead her toward the main reactor hall. She left the chamber without a word, the heavy door sliding shut behind her to seal the room. Steve's body remained on the floor, a quiet testament to the cost of the Ashford family's eugenics program. Claire navigated the frozen corridors, her boots clicking against the ice-slicked stone as she moved toward the final confrontation. The tragedy had sharpened her resolve, making her a much more dangerous asset than Alexia could ever anticipate. Part 45, Wesker versus Alexia, Albert Wesker's host. Capture Force espionage submarine docked at the facility's deep water port, and the enhanced captain marched directly into the main hall to claim the T. Veronica virus. He was instantly confronted by Alexia Ashford. In a shocking display of biological supremacy, Alexia easily outmatched Wesker's superhuman speed. Her incendiary blood violently ignited the air, forcing a severely burned and deeply humbled Wesker to execute a hasty, strategic retreat from the chamber. Realizing he could not defeat her in direct hand-to-hand combat, Wesker had entered the room with absolute confidence in his own capabilities, his prototype infection giving him a physical edge that no regular human could handle. He'd tracked the researcher's energy signature through the central monitor, his focus locked on securing the pristine sample before the base entered the final stages of its collapse. Alexia stood in the center of the hall, her presence radiating a heat that made the surrounding ice melt into thick, black puddles. She didn't look like a researcher, but a monarch waiting for a peasant. The first exchange happened in a blur of motion that shattered the marble columns near the staircase. Wesker tried to bridge the gap, with a kinetic strike, but Alexia deflected his arm with a fluid, insectoid speed that left him off balance. She released a burst of fire pheromones from her throat, the gas igniting instantly to turn the room into an oven of white flame. Wesker's expensive tactical suit began to singe, his skin blistering as he realized the virus had given her total control over the atmosphere. He attempted to adjust his posture, but Alexia lashed out with a bone-plated tentacle that sent him flying into the glass walls of the observation deck. The captain gasped for air, his regeneration struggling to handle the intense thermal damage to his lungs. He looked up at the Queen, his red eyes burning with impotent rage as he recognized that his own evolution was inferior to her hive mind structure. He was a prototype, a partial success in a grand experiment that she had already finished. The retreat wasn't a choice. It was a survival necessity dictated by his deteriorating physical stats. Wesker activated his emergency evac signal, his body limping as he scrambled toward the dark shadows of the lower maintenance tunnels. He was a man who planned for every contingency, but he hadn't accounted for a biological monarch who could turn the air itself into a weapon. He left the hall, his pride shattered and his body ruined by the encounter with the last heir of Ashford. Alexia watched him vanish, her humming returning to the quiet space of the atrium. She didn't chase him, knowing he was a broken asset that couldn't threaten her domain. She stood alone in the heat, the fire of her blood casting long, dancing shadows against the ice walls of the facility. The board of directors would never receive the sample they'd paid for, their espionage venture ending in a burned suit and a hasty exit. Part 46. What Wesker left. With recognizing that direct combat with Alexia was a failing strategy, Wesker pivoted to his true corporate parameters. His agents located Steve Burnside's fresh corpse inside the detention cells and downloaded the complete, pristine T. Veronica research data from the facility's main server arrays. Wesker's syndicate employers wanted both assets to extract the stabilized viral strains lingering in Steve's rewritten DNA, a successful harvest that directly allowed Wesker to retain his black market leverage, while Steve's harvested body was preserved in corporate stasis for future viral engineering. The extraction was a clinical, efficient process carried out by the host capture force operators who had trailed their captain into the dark. They treated the dead teenager with the same indifference they'd show to an industrial part, sealing his body inside a liquid nitrogen transport container to prevent his genetic code from degrading. Wesker watched the download progress on his handheld tablet, his focus entirely on the stream of data that contained the secrets of the Queen's birth. He'd lost the fight, but he'd secured the intelligence his investors demanded. The data stream was the exhaustive library of their family's eugenics program, detailing the exact hormonal ratios required to fuse the insect DNA with the progenitor base. Wesker knew that this information would allow his syndicate to leapfrog over the company's remaining research divisions, granting them a definitive lead in the global weapons market. He stood in the transport bay, his hands steady as he locked the data drive into his vest pocket. The retreat had been a strategic pivot rather than a total loss. He didn't care about the tragedy of the teenager, his mind already calculating how to use the blood for his own Ouroboros project. He saw the potential for a perfected strain, one that could merge the hive mind efficiency with his own superhuman speed. He checked the status of the submarine, the engines humming in the deep water below the facility. The mission was complete. He had the virus, the DNA, and the path forward for his employer's agenda. The HCF operators gathered their gear, their movements rapid and disciplined as they moved toward the hangar bay for their final extraction. They left the facility in the hands of the monarch, their presence erased from the logs before the base's self-destruct sequence hit the critical stage. Wesker stepped onto the deck of his ship, the sub-zero wind cutting through the cabin as he watched the Antarctic coast disappear into the fog. He was a survivor who always collected a profit. The data drive was his real victory, a blueprint that he would eventually use to turn the world into a garden for his own design. He checked his reflection in the cabin glass, his red eyes steady as he plotted the next chapter of his corporate war. He'd lost a fight, but he'd won the future, his mind already spinning with the possibilities of what he could build with the blood of an Ashford. The facility burned behind him, a distant fire that looked small against the vast expanse of the ice. Part 47, Chris versus Alexia, Stage 1. Chris Redfield stepped between Alexia and his sister to allow Claire to reach the upper helipad. Alexia underwent her Stage 1 mutation, shedding her aristocratic flesh for an insectoid, flame-throwing carapace. She utilized her advanced fire pheromone system to spray columns of living fire across the arena, the intense heat warping the metal floor of the hall into a twisted shape. Chris utilized an experimental, high-voltage linear launcher prototype weapon, the singular answer capable of destabilizing her cells, to fire a concentrated energy bolt into her chest, forcing her to curse his human arrogance as her physical shell buckled. The launcher was a heavy, industrial piece of hardware that he'd scavenged from the base's security vault, an experimental device designed to handle large-scale bioweapons. Chris fired the weapon with a practiced rhythm, the energy bolt striking the Queen's carapace with a blinding blue flash. Alexia reeled backward, her insectoid limbs lashing out to tear the air as she tried to maintain her dominance. She hadn't expected a regular human to possess the technological leverage to break her physical shell. She laughed a high, frantic soprano, the sound mixing with the roar of her own fire as she evolved to counter his attacks. Her carapace grew thicker, the chitinous plates shifting to cover her exposed heart with a layer of hardened bone. She sprayed a new, more concentrated stream of pheromones, the liquid fire coating the ceiling of the hall until the entire structure began to melt. Chris kept his distance, his boots sliding on the wet marble as he lined up his next shot. He knew that the energy bolt was the only answer. His standard rifle fire wasn't even scratching the surface of her mutation. He stayed focused on his target, his mind mapping the Queen's movements through the haze of the flames. She was a biological monarch who commanded the base, but she was still a prisoner to the same viral logic that had destroyed her father. Chris waited for the perfect opening, his finger tight on the trigger as she moved to finish the fight. The energy strike shattered her left wing, the insectoid limb falling to the floor with a wet thud. Alexia's control over the fire pheromones flickered for a second, the flames shrinking as her internal pressure dropped. She cursed the soldier's existence, her voice dropping into a deep, guttural register that sounded like grinding stone. She realized she was facing an opponent who didn't fight with instinct, but with the cold, calculated training of a veteran operative. Chris stepped forward, his launcher humming, with the charge for the final blow of the exchange. He watched the Queen scramble away, her movements frantic as she tried to reach the lower levels of the hall to secure her survival. He held his ground, his eyes tracking her as she vanished into the shadows of the machinery. The first stage of the battle was finished, but the Queen wasn't dead, her biology already pushing for a new, more dangerous form. Part 48, Alexia Stage 2 and 3. The injury triggered a catastrophic cellular acceleration, forcing Alexia into her grotesque Stage 2 and 3 forms. She expanded into a massive, stationary egg-laying queen that birthed swarms of parasitic insects, before detaching her upper torso to become a hovering, airborne, wasp-like predator. The entire room became a gauntlet of falling fire and lashing tentacles. Chris timed his shots perfectly, utilizing the final charge of the linear launcher to fire a precise energy blast that permanently vaporized the last surviving heir of the Ashford noble lineage. The transformation was a violent, rapid evolution that shattered the remaining marble columns of the atrium. Alexia's body grew into a pulsating organic tower that dominated the center of the hall, her tentacles sweeping the area with a lethal, indiscriminate force. Swarms of black insects poured from her body, their wings a constant buzz that sounded like a broken generator. Chris moved through the swarm, using his combat knife to clear the biting pests, while he reloaded the launcher for the kill shot. The Queen's airborne form was a terrifying display of biological malice, her upper torso hovering with a grace that mocked the gravity of the room. She lashed out with elongated stingers, each strike leaving a trail of acidic venom that ate through the concrete flooring in seconds. Chris dodged the lashing limbs, his focus locked on the bright, pulsing center of her heart as it struggled to maintain the shell. She was a god of her own design, but she was rapidly running out of tissue to support the weight of her ambition. The final charge ignited with a low, building hum that felt like an earthquake in his hands. Chris waited for the Queen to lunge, her stingers extended for a final, lethal thrust that would end the battle. He fired the bolt at the center of her chest, the energy strike vaporizing the parasite's core in a blinding, silent explosion. Alexia's body shuddered, her form turning into a grey, brittle powder as the viral engine failed for the last time. She didn't offer a final request, her body simply ceasing to be as the energy bolt finished the work. The swarms died instantly, dropping to the floor like discarded autumn leaves as the pheromone frequency dissolved. The hall was suddenly quiet, the only sound the crackle of the lingering fires that clung to the ceiling. Chris stood in the center of the ruin, his launcher empty and his lungs burning from the toxic smoke. The Ashford bloodline was permanently erased from the corporate record, their dreams of a monarchy ending in a cold laboratory floor. Chris checked his gear, his mind already shifting toward the extraction protocols. The Queen was gone, but the base was still alive with the fire, the self-destruct countdown ticking down on the monitors above his head. He turned toward the hangar, his legs heavy as he raced to finish his mission. Part 49. The Self-Destruct and the Fighter Jet. With Alexia dead, Chris armed the facility's master self-destruct system, triggering an automated 5-minute countdown. As the foundations began to violently collapse in a series of massive internal thermal explosions, Chris and Claire raced through the buckling hangar yards. They had to navigate a landscape of falling steel and cascading ice, the structure protesting the activation of the reactor core. Every second was a battle against the geometry of the base as it folded inward to bury its secrets. They reached the primary hangar lift just as the secondary generators blew, the impact knocking Claire off her feet. Chris caught her hand, pulling her toward the Harrier jet that sat on the landing pad. The aircraft was already powered, its engines roaring with a steady, high-pitched scream that matched the alarm sirens. They climbed into the cockpit, their hands working in a fluid, practiced rhythm to engage the takeoff protocols before the hangar doors could crush them. The jet rose through the aperture of the ceiling, its thrusters kicking up a cloud of loose snow as it banked toward the dark sky. Behind them, the entire Antarctic black site vanished in a roaring mountain of fire that lit up the continent like a secondary sun. The ice shelf groaned under the pressure of the explosion, the massive craters instantly filling with the surrounding white drifts. They were free of the base, the cold wind of the southern sky a sudden relief. The Harrier climbed through the clouds, its navigation computer pointing toward the nearest civilian outpost at a safe distance from the detonation zone. Claire looked at her brother, her face showing a quiet exhaustion, as the adrenaline of the escape finally began to ebb. They had lost the teenager to the Queen's hunger, but they had secured the data that would hold the company's survivors accountable. They were two witnesses who had walked out of the graveyard. The facility was gone, a buried memory that would leave no corporate record in the archives of the board. Chris kept his eyes on the monitors, ensuring the aircraft's stability as they cleared the hazardous zone of the fallout. The mission was a success by military standards, but the psychological cost was heavy, a burden they would carry long after they returned to the world. They were alive, and that was the only metric that mattered. The jet leveled off above the clouds. The Antarctic winter night stretched out ahead of them in an endless, frozen line. They headed north, leaving the ice and the monsters behind them. The silence of the cabin was a welcome change, the steady rhythm of the engines the only sound in the world. They were finally going home, the war against the institution continuing, but their part in this specific battle finally finished. Part 50, what came next. Upon returning to civil society, the Redfield siblings underwent an intensive classified military debriefing, maintaining a protective silence regarding the tragic fate of Steve Burnside. The corporation's lawyers scrubbed the details of the Antarctica incident from the official record, treating the destruction of their sub-zero base as a simple industrial accident. Chris and Claire were left with the truth, a reality that the world wasn't ready to face, their loyalty to each other keeping the memory of the teenager safe from the corporate vultures. The events of Code. Veronica fundamentally altered the balance of global power, shifting the resources of the remaining Umbrella factions toward an uncertain future. Wesker's successful theft of the T. Veronica virus from Steve's body provided him with the exact genetic data needed to stabilize his upcoming world-ending Ouroboros project in Resident Evil 5. The Queen's blood became the foundation for his own ascension, proving that even in her defeat, the family's research continued to serve the captain's agenda. This story stands as the ultimate psychological turning point of the classic era, a masterpiece of gothic bio-horror and sibling devotion that has never received the definitive modern video production it deserves. It wasn't just a mission, but a transition into a new, more dangerous world, where the monsters weren't coming from the basement anymore, but from the boardrooms of global corporations. The Redfields had learned the cost of survival, their lives permanently adjusted to the rhythm of a war that didn't have an exit strategy. Wesker disappeared into the black market, his HCF unit operating in the shadows of the falling pharmaceutical empire. He had the data, the DNA, and the path forward for his employer's vision, his presence a constant low-frequency hum in the background of global affairs. Chris began his long, isolated transition toward the BSAA, his tactical skills sharpening as he prepared to fight the next wave of bioterrorism. He knew that the war wouldn't end until he personally ended his former captain. Claire left the service, her focus shifting toward advocacy for the survivors of the Raccoon City disaster. She'd learned that the institutions didn't care about individual lives. Her own experience with the government handlers in America, fueling her drive to expose their secrets to the public. She remained the only person who knew the true story of the Antarctic facility, a guardian of the memory that she wouldn't sell to any corporate archive. Her life was her own, but it was marked by the frost. The world would continue to spin, The pharmaceutical giants would continue to pivot toward new, deadlier pathogens, and the citizens would continue to sleep in the dark. The story of the Ashford twins was a footnote in a larger, darker history, a tragedy that the company would try to bury under layers of bureaucratic denial. But for the Redfield siblings, the truth was an absolute, an anchor that kept them grounded through every future outbreak. They kept fighting because it's the only way to stay human in a world that sells your own cells for a profit.